Hello and welcome back to my channel. Make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. Let's begin. Chapter 47, Hollow and Faceless. Rukia. Duck. Ichigo yelled as he hurtled straight at her, a hollow hot on his heels. Without pause, Rukia complied, spinning low and lashing out with her Zanpakuto as he vaulted over her, drilling his foot into the mask of a hollow who was charging straight at her. The top half of the mask shattered, but he'd already kicked off towards another hollow. He spun to avoid its vicious swipe, completing the move by bringing his Zanpakuto down on its arm and severing it clean off. With a yell, he twisted his sword round and drove it through the base of its neck, where it exploded out from the back in a shower of blood and cutting its pained screams short. Yanking out his Zanpakuto, he kicked the hollow away as he turned to engage yet another one. Rukia caught sight of a hollow charging towards her from the side. Both hands gripping her Zanpakuto, she sliced horizontally through the mask of her current target and turned to the hollow which had locked onto her. Rukia. Duck. Decades of fighting and working together gave Rukia the understanding that, while Ichigo knew he was easily more powerful than her, she was by no means a pushover, and he respected her abilities, much like she respected his. While he was concerned for her, he wasn't going to become overprotective of her. He tried that once in Inuzuri. She wasn't about to let him do it again. Of course, after so long, she was able to subconsciously sense where he was, so when he shouted at her, she could tell he was heading straight for her. Complying, she spun low and struck out with her Zanpakuto, and sure enough, her reaction was validated as Ichigo leapt over her, and her sword connected with the hollow that had been chasing him. Her attack completely severed one of the hollow's forelegs and sliced deep into the other one, causing it to go crashing to the ground. Its momentum made it skid forward, but Rukia had already leapt over it with her palm outstretched. Heido number 33, Shikaho. A red ball of flame collided with the hollow's head, but Rukia didn't pause to inspect the damage, immediately swerving to avoid a large arm that slammed into the ground, threatening to flatten her. She touched down on the ground and immediately took off again, effortlessly speeding past the hollow's defense and plunging her Zanpakuto straight through its mask. The two of them stood in a patch of open area, twisting and weaving, sometimes crossing paths but never hitting the other, a duet performing a deadly ballet of death. The hollows fell one after another, attracted by the large Ryatsu signatures, but only finding their end. But yet still more came, scores swarming out of two nearby tears in the sky and heading straight for them. Silently relishing the fact that she could now do this, her Zanpakuto glowed as she released her Shirkai. She fired off a significantly more powerful Shikaho, taking out two hollows to give herself slightly more time. Just then, she heard Ichigo shout, "There's too many of them. Use Sodi no Shirayuki." Way ahead of you, she grinned as she rapidly stabbed the ground. However, instead of 4 times, she punctured the ground 6 times, creating a semicircle in front of her. Then she slid into her stance and turned to look at Ichigo, mere feet behind her. Ichigo. Despite the huge number of hollows, Ichigo was still, presumably, a captain of the Gotei 13, one already enhanced with the powers of a hollow as well, and the many hollows that were swarming him and his partner were mostly of the basic sort. Still, there's truth in the saying that there's strength in numbers. He'd already narrowly missed 2 strikes by different hollows, and there seemed to be no end to the creatures spewing out of the 2 nearby tiers, dimensions to the hollow home world of Hueco Mundo. If he wasn't careful, he might suffer injuries that were easily avoidable. Perhaps he ought to try leveling the playing field a little. Rukia, he shouted to his partner, who was similarly ducking and weaving, throwing out Kido more frequently than him, but still holding her own easily. Still, she was threatening to get swamped as well. There's too many of them. Use Sodi no Shirayuki, he yelled as he released his own Zanpakuto as well. Way ahead of you, he heard Rukia call back. Dispatching yet another hollow, he turned and saw her already poised, her Zanpakuto already released and icy Ryatsu swirling up from the punctures in the ground in front of her. Vaguely, he wondered why he didn't hear her call out her Shirkai release command, but the heat of battle quickly shoved that question aside. He smirked back at her, pulling Zangetsu back. Getsuga. Tsugi no Mai. Tensho. Hakuren. It was quite convenient that they had taken the battle to an open and empty field. Their two attacks exploded out in a surge of power, one half white and the other dark blue. About one half of the hollows were frozen solid, dead without even knowing it, while the other half was completely engulfed in dark blue energy and obliterated without a trace. The two attacks slammed into the openings, clearing out the emerging hollows and overloading them with enough Ryatsu to close them. The two of them stood still for a moment, the lack of roars and metal slicing flesh creating a deafening silence. "Is that all?" Ichigo said. "Unlikely," Rukia replied, just as their phones cut through the quiet. She took out her phone while Ichigo ignored his. "It's Urahara. He says there's another one opening up here again. And another one a few kilometers that way," she pointed somewhere to the right. "I'll deal with the one here," Ichigo replied. "Let's clear this up so I can give that dumbass a piece of my mind." Rukia nodded and sped in the direction she pointed, just as the air some distance from Ichigo's left seemed to fold over itself. Then, the fold split apart, revealing a swirling, chaotic mess of grayish-black. A talon gripped the opening, and a hollow's head poked into view. The roar had barely left its throat before a beam of white light drilled through its mask, right between its eyes. The hollow fell out of view, only for another two to take its place. They too met their quick end with well-shot beams aimed between their eyes. However, as the opening became larger, more and more hollows began spewing out, faster than Ichigo could cast Byakurai. He snarled and abandoned his Kido target practice, gripping his sword and charging forward. "If that baka isn't dead when this is over, I'll kill him myself." 2 hollow baits. 2. He thought. Viciously. 20 minutes earlier. As the streak of Ryatsu rocketed towards them, Ichigo could sense, and was surprised at, the speed and power of the projectile. His first instinct was to leap away, but a quick analysis revealed that the projectile's height was too low, its trajectory would carry it just short of them. He stood his ground, as did Rukia, who'd evidently reached the same conclusion as him. Sure enough, the projectile pierced the ground mere inches from his foot, where it shattered into multiple pieces and dissipated quickly. "Such a move can be perceived as an act of hostility," he said calmly, although his senses were now on high gear. A hand hovered above his pants pocket, where his Jiken dispenser rested, waiting to be called to use at a moment's notice. His Jigai limited the use of his abilities, and he could tell this was one individual he couldn't underestimate. "That arrow was never going to reach you," Uryu said stoically. "Although I suppose you already knew that." Ichigo and Rukia looked at each other. "What do you want, Ishida?" Rukia asked. "As I've said before, nothing much. Just a challenge to prove that your kind is not needed in this world." They both stared in confusion and surprise at their classmate, whose normally calm and neutral blue eyes were blazing with a cold fury. "Doesn't sound like that's your only motivation," Rukia continued. "Perceptive indeed, Kuchiki, and you would be right. I am the last Quincy, and as such, I hate Shinigami." At this second mention of Quincy, Ichigo started searching through his knowledge about the Quincy. It was a topic he'd last heard about in the academy. The Quincy were a group of spiritually aware humans that had existed for centuries, even before the Tokugawa shogunate. They were able to see hollows, and by extension, Shinigami as well, and had developed weapons and abilities to combat these hollows. The standard Quincy weapon was that of a bow and arrow made out of Raishii. However, unlike Shinigami, whose Zanpakuto and Kido spells would send the hollow's soul to Soul Society, any hollow killed by a Quincy would have its soul removed from existence completely. For a couple of centuries, Shinigami welcomed the Quincy and worked alongside them peacefully, not stopping to second-guess the long-term effects. However, it was eventually discovered that their methods were upsetting the balance of the living world and spiritual world. If allowed to continue, it would result in the destruction of both worlds. When confronted with this, the Quincy admitted that they hadn't known about the effects their weapons had on hollows, but when asked to cease, they had refused. It was in their opinion that these creatures, who had slain many a Quincy, did not deserve to be sent to Soul Society. As a result, relations between both factions quickly soured, and eventually turned hostile. This led to the Shinigami undertaking a campaign to wipe out all the Quincy some 200 years ago. Since then, no Quincy had been seen or reported, until now that is. So. Let me get this straight. You hate us for being Shinigami because we wiped out the Quincy some 200 years ago? Ichigo asked in an attempt to avoid a confrontation. Not that I agree with my predecessor's actions, but neither of us were even around when that happened. And you're blaming us for that? No offense, but that's stupid and petty. For that matter, neither of us has even done anything to you. Yuryu gave a mirthless chuckle. Oh no, I never said anything about this being about my ancestors. If anything, I agree with what the Shinigami did. Then why dash? However, your Shinigami caused the death of my mentor and grandfather. The one who taught and trained me in the ways of the Quincy. Ichigo was surprised to hear that, but now he could sort of understand the grudge. He felt Rukia shift slightly beside him, and his mind flashed briefly back to that fateful night in Rukongai, when Rukia too lost a mentor, and he, a friend. My condolences, but I had no idea Shinigami killed him. I didn't say anything about killing him, Yuryu cut in tersely. No, they stood aside and allowed him to be cut down by a swath of hollows. He'd been speaking up for cooperation between the Quincy and Shinigami, trying to find some way to reach an agreement for both parties to work together. But no, they allowed him to die simply because they lumped him into the same mold as my ancestors, the ones who refused to think about the big picture of their actions. He steeled himself. But still, his death has taught me one thing. Shinigami care only for themselves. You all have your own agenda, and you couldn't care less who you step on along the way. What? Rukia exclaimed. Whatever gave you that idea? Don't you? Yuryu shot back. You suddenly appear out of nowhere to join Karakura High. Oh yes, I knew who you two were the moment I laid eyes on you. I can give you credit for keeping up pretenses for so long, but it ends here. I'll send you back before you can do whatever it is you're here for. Are you kidding me? Ichigo growled back. Do you know how stupid you sound right now? You're heaping baseless accusations on us and blaming us for something we weren't even aware about, let alone played a part in. Yuryu's eyes narrowed in anger, but Ichigo himself was losing patience. His classmate had every reason to be angry, but he was not about to stand still and be used as a convenient target. But if you must know why we're here, it's because we're in voluntary exile from Soul Society due to circumstances beyond our control. Whatever Yuryu was expecting to hear, it wasn't that. The surprised look on his face lasted for about a split second before it was replaced once again with a calm demeanor. That changes nothing. You two are Shinigami, so when you eventually go running back to Soul Society with your tail between your legs, you can tell them that you lost to a Quincy, he responded frostily. Ichigo stared at him incredulously. You know what? He shook his head. No. I do not accept your stupid challenge, whatever it is. I understand your anger, but until you're finally ready to settle this issue non-violently and not focus your blame on us, please don't approach us about this. If we ever return back to Soul Society, we'll raise this issue, but until then, this will not solve anything. He turned to Rukia. Come on, Rukia, let's dash. You don't get it, do you? You're participating, whether you like it or not. Or do you want to have the lives in this town hanging over your heads? Yuryu's smug voice reached them. What are you talking about? Ichigo turned back to Yuryu, who was holding up a hand. In it, he held a white coin-shaped item. What's that? He heard Rukia ask first. It looked perfectly harmless, but he knew it probably wasn't. Shinigami are not to harm humans or, to their best efforts, allow them to come to harm, is that correct? Neither of them answered, both wondering where he was going with this. Well then, let's put that to the test, shall we? Yuryu waved the object in the air. This, for lack of a better term, is hollow bait. Hollow bait? It does what its name suggests. Once I crush this tablet and scatter it, hollows will come running. So the one who defeats the most hollows until the effects wear off is the winner. Neither of them answered, because the moment Yuryu revealed the effects of the object, both of them made identical movements. In one lightning-quick move, they both shot forward and pulled out their Jiken dispensers at the same time. Free from the restrictions of their Jigai, both covered the distance to Yuryu in nanoseconds, immediately using Shunpa once the Jiken came into contact with their tongues. Both of them had only one target, the hollow bait in Yuryu's hand. Trained by Shihoin Yoruchi for almost 2 years, Rukia was a hair's breadth faster, but her fingers closed around thin air. Wadash! Hirenkyaku, a voice spoke to their left, and they whirled round to see Yuryu standing a few feet away. He had his bow drawn and pointed straight at them, except that instead of the chaotic streak of blue he'd used earlier that vaguely resembled a bow, the one he currently wielded now had the definite solid shape of a composite bow. It was blue in color, and had streaks of white running along its length in an intricate pattern. The Quincy version of what you Shinigami call Shunpa. Did you really think I wasn't expecting that? How naive. I'll say this again, Kurosaki, Kuchiki. Do not underestimate me. I won't miss from this distance. You two are participating, whether you like it or not. Are you insane? Rukia yelled. You're exposing the townspeople to danger just for the sake of your challenge. Ah, but that's where the two of you come in, isn't it? You'll not sit idle and will do your best to ensure no one comes to harm. And even if you can't do it, this is, after all, my town. I won't let anyone die today. The tense standoff lasted for another silent 10 seconds. Neither Shinigami made a move. They could easily dodge his arrows, but Yuryu had proven that he too was fast and was already anticipating their actions. Catching him off guard wasn't a viable option for now. You're crazy, Ishida. In fact, you're straight up insane. You're willing to gamble others' lives for the sake of a challenge. I'm not risking anyone's life, Yuryu replied coolly. On the pride and honor of the Quincy, no one will come to harm. In fact, he lowered his bow, the Raishii arrow fading away. How about we up the stakes? Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew the hollow bait, this time accompanied with an identical twin. I didn't plan on using this, but since there are 3 of us, I trust this wouldn't be a problem. Realizing that there was nothing he could do to dissuade Yuryu, Ichigo replied, if anyone dies, you're answering for it. I don't care if you're the last Quincy or not. Ishida merely smiled. I look forward to it. With the 2 baits held firmly between his index finger and thumb, Yuryu squeezed, and they broke apart with a soft crunch. And so, not 10 minutes later, Ichigo found himself splitting up with Rukia to tackle hollows in separate locations. Yuryu had long since disappeared in another direction. Despite what he'd just done, Ichigo grudgingly acknowledged that their classmate didn't seem to be just spouting hot air. Just 5 seconds after Yuryu had crushed the hollow bait, the first hollow made its appearance. Not expecting one to appear that quickly, Ichigo and Rukia reacted a little slower than usual. That was enough time for Yuryu to snap his bow up and let fly, nailing the hollow right in its head before it had even emerged halfway. Yuryu then smirked at them. Better move faster, you two. Without another word, he disappeared, just as more hollows started pouring out of the opening the first hollow left behind. Seconds later, another opening appeared. Scowling as he effortlessly batted away a hollow's attack, Ichigo made a mental note to give Yuryu a good trashing after this was over. Although the Quincy couldn't have known, the hollow bait had just put the 2 of them at risk, not from the hollows, but from detection by Soul Society. He didn't know how the Ran-D wing of the 12th Division operated, but surely a swarm of hollows were unlikely to go uninvestigated. A scream suddenly pierced through Ichigo's thoughts. Quickly clearing some room for himself, Ichigo turned, and felt his blood run cold. A few hollows that hadn't gone after him were bearing down on a young boy. Confusion reigned momentarily for a second, Hollows didn't go after normal humans whimsically unless they had spiritual power in them. And then he saw the chain trailing behind the young boy. Sheet, he swore. A plus. Why did one have to appear here now, of all times? Quickly dispatching a couple more hollows, he charged after the group, but the lead hollow, a big, bipedal monster, struck with its long forearm, and caught the boy square in the back. The boy flew forward, skidding painfully on the ground, and the group of hollows pounced. Getsuga Aisu. Ichigo yelled as he shot past a tree, plunging Zangetsu into the shadow it casted on the ground. Just inches from the fallen plus, a large, shadowy blade surged from the shadow of the hulking lead hollow. It struck the hollow at an angle, severing it cleanly in two. Not losing speed, he pulled Zangetsu back, and the shadowy blade followed his actions, running it clean through a few more hollows. But one dodged. No. Ichigo surged forward with an urgent burst of Shunpa. He was late by mere fractions. The young boy's screams lasted for all but a second before it was cut short as the hollow sank its razor-sharp teeth into him, just moments before Ichigo rammed Zangetsu through its head. The hollow released its hold on the boy and gave a pained roar, but even that was cut short as Ichigo twisted his sword and kicked its corpse away. Granted a brief respite, Ichigo turned to check on the boy, and felt a surge of guilt and anger when all he saw were lifeless eyes staring off into a distance. The hollow had been much bigger than the boy, and with the speed it was moving, he never stood a chance. The multiple puncture wounds on his neck though, which was also twisted at a weird angle, suggested that, while undoubtedly painful, he'd at least been granted a quick death. Anger bubbled inside him as he turned to face the renewed onslaught of hollows. Yes, Ishida had a lot to answer to. 161, Yuryu smirked to himself as that last arrow bore through 3 hollows at the same time. Unlike Ichigo and Rukia's locations, the hollows appearing near his vicinity were emerging from smaller, less stable openings which admitted no more than 4 at a time. They appeared all around him, which suited him perfectly. From where he was, he could easily pick off hollows as they surfaced and not waste precious time by moving around. He sensed a portal opening to his left. He pivoted on his back foot, his bow already drawn, his finger hooked around the ring in the center of the bowstring. The ring, while not unique, allowed him to pull the bowstring tighter, loading it with more erasure. The arrow was released as a tear opened in the sky and a hollow stepped out, followed closely by another. Moments later, their existence was erased completely as the blue arrow drilled straight through their masks, causing their bodies to crumble into nothing. 163 He allowed himself no time to gloat, as another tier had opened up behind him. Pushing off with his back foot, Yuryu pivoted on his front foot, releasing another arrow even before both feet were on the ground, dispatching another hollow with nothing more than an afterthought. As the hollows continued appearing thick and fast, the adrenaline coursing through his body slowly shaved fractions off his reaction time, and he found himself relying more on his training and instinct, firing off shots at an even more rapid pace and spending less time aiming. It was something taught by his grandfather who, while compassionate and doting, had been intensive when it came to training. He'd trained him to trust his instincts and spend less time aiming. No target is going to stay still, he'd replied sagely upon Yuryu's questions. Learn to trust your instincts. Ever since his death, Yuryu's aim had yet to let him down, and he wasn't about to start now. 172. As he shifted his location slightly, a voice at the back of his head was pointing out to him that the number of hollows was becoming unusually high. His concern, however, was fleeting. After all, he'd used 2 baits, so it was to be expected. Just then, at least 10 tears opened up simultaneously, spilling out a new horde of hollows unfazed. Yuryu balled up his fist and held it against the arrow rest. A ball of blue light gathered in his fist as Yuryu pulled his arm back, creating a streak of blue many times larger than usual. Mentally noting the positions of the hollows, who were just started to notice him, he opened his palm, releasing the streak of blue. Immediately, it split apart into 5 blue lances of light which, with deadly precision, found their way through the masks of 7 hollows. Repeating the process 3 more times, He cleared out the rest of the hollows in another 15 seconds. He allowed himself a smile of satisfaction. This technique, which he'd only just created weeks ago, was certainly useful, even though he could only split his shot into 5 so far. After a couple more seconds of respite, he decided that this area was clear of hollows for now. Flexing his fingers, he leapt off in the direction he'd sensed hollows appearing earlier, ignoring the slight numbness in his index fingers. Just wait, sensei, he thought determinedly. I'll prove our race is worth yet. After over a year and a half's worth of training with Yoruchi, Rukia was beginning to see the fruits of her training. 1 or 2 wasn't enough to test her, but a swarm of hollows certainly did. And she marveled at its effects. While there had been hand-to-hand combat training involved, Yoruchi recognized that Rukia was a swordswoman, and thus focused on incorporating more speed into her sword's fighting techniques, eliminating unnecessary redundancies in her movements. It was, in the end, what gave her the edge to defeat her Zanpakuto and force Sodi no Shirayuki to submit. She was still trying to wrap her mind around it. She, a third-seat class Shinigami, had achieved the ultimate technique of a Shinigami, something it was said only captains could achieve. Granted, it was the training Yoruchi gave her that enabled her to attain it, but it was still an achievement. Unfortunately, while fighting the hollows and remaining mindful to steer clear of unaware bystanders, she had to quash the temptation of using it. Firstly, her additional training made it unnecessary and overkill. And secondly, until further training, using it was potentially fatal for her to use. Thirdly, she wanted to surprise Ichigo with it, though she would have to be mindful he wasn't caught in the blast too. Right now, though, her Shikai was more than enough, as she ducked and weaved through the horde of monsters, blocking only when necessary. Her faithful Zanpakuto in hand, her movements were a blur as she slashed tendons, hacked limbs, and pierced masks, spurts of blood spouting around her as she twirled a bloody dance of death. But the hollows still kept coming, attempting to crush her with sheer numbers. This is getting ridiculous, she thought irritably. She hadn't been keeping track of the number of hollows she'd taken down, but it had to be at least a couple of hundred of them, with the numbers showing no signs of slowing down. How in the world did Ishida get a hold of something so potent? She ducked and spun round to avoid a hollow that had launched itself at her. It sailed over, but instead of paying it any mind, Rukia angled her sword down, aiming it a few meters in front of her as she completed the spin. A line formed at where she was aiming, drawing out a circle. The moment it was completed, the ground within the circle froze almost instantly, along with 4 hollows that had been within the circle. They were in turn smashed to pieces moments later as their fellow hollows ran straight through them. Some no mai. Rukia intoned, leaping up into the air. The hollows leapt after her, chasing from below her, which was exactly what she wanted. Tsukishiro. She yelled, zipping away with Shuunpa. A pillar of white, with the ice circle as the base, speared from the ground. Not as visible in the daylight, it engulfed most of the hollows, bathing them in the opaque, blinding whiteness. A blast of frigid air pulsed out, staggering the others who were closest to the pillar. But Rukia was already on the move, speeding back down to the ground to re-engage the remaining hollows. She didn't need to see what became of rest. Sure enough, the white pillar faded to reveal that all the hollows that had been caught within the pillar had frozen solid, each encased in a solid block of ice. They seemed to suspend in midair for a few moments before they fell, shattering into pieces as they crashed into the ground. With their numbers drastically reduced, Rukia cut through them, bathing the battlefield with their blood. I think that's the last of them here, she said to herself. Unfortunately, she could not afford to relax. As she'd been fighting, her phone had rung a few times, signaling hollows appearing in other areas. Despite being on the run from Soul Society, she was still a Shinigami, and she couldn't allow hollows to run amok amongst the innocent living. They were powerful, yes, but it was only 3 of them plus the posted Shinigami. There was no telling what carnage the hollows already wrought, so she quickly stretched out her senses to search for more of them. She sensed Ichigo quite some distance away, surrounded by hollow signatures that were rapidly winking out. Knowing that he didn't need any aid, she turned her attentions elsewhere, and they fell on another large group of hollows. As she quickly rushed over, she nearly halted in surprise and confusion when a completely unfamiliar Ryatsu suddenly burst into life in the middle of the group, corresponding with a quarter of the hollow signatures disappearing. Immediately, the new Ryatsu started moving, and the hollow signatures started systematically disappearing. What was going on? Just where did this newcomer come from? But even as these questions ran through her head, Rukia felt the new Ryatsu fluctuate erratically, as if whatever its owner was doing was wreaking havoc with his or her powers. Regardless, she had to hurry. An hour earlier. Sato remained silent, again, no surprise there, as he watched his two close friends pack up for the day. Rukia finished first. She waited while Ichigo searched around his desk for a pen he hadn't realized had dropped into his bag, all the while teasing him playfully for being so disorganized even as she helped him search. Ichigo countered good-naturedly, and the banter shifted back and forth until Rukia found the pen first, which she promptly used to rap Ichigo on the head with. The exchange went back and forth for a few more times before they were ready to leave. As they headed out, Ichigo gave a nod in his direction while Rukia smiled and gave a light wave. While they would usually hang out on certain days of the week, Tuesdays were never one of those days. The two of them usually left immediately after class. He supposed they had some extracurricular activity, helping out at Dr. Kurosaki's clinic, perhaps, because he knew the two of them didn't join any of the school's clubs, and it wasn't due to a lack of offers. Standing up to Oshima in front of the school had elevated Ichigo to near-god status, since no one had been willing to stand up to Oshima and his cronies. Sato knew he could, but Oshima had had enough brain cells to not try anything with him. Days later, Ichigo had received offers from all the martial arts clubs like Aikido, Judo, Karate, and Jiu-Jitsu to join them. Strangely enough, the day after Ichigo's trouncing of Oshima, Arisawa Tatsuki, their classmate and second strongest female in Japan in the under-21's age group, with the handicap of a broken arm, approached Rukia to join the karate club. Of course, Sato knew she could fight, but was surprised that Arisawa did. Perhaps she'd realized that the discreet kick Rukia had used to knock Oshima out wasn't accidental. He stifled a yawn, slightly glad that school was already over, since all he had the night before was a couple of hours of unsettled sleep. The haunting, disembodied scream he'd heard during Don Kanoji's program refused to leave his ears, echoing in his head well into the night and piercing through his subconscious every time he attempted to drift off to sleep. It had left him feeling uncharacteristically nervous and jumpy on the way home from the program, and he'd nearly lashed out at a cat that'd jump out in front of him. Before experiencing the program live, he'd been slightly skeptical about the existence of spirits, but the scream he heard was not human. But it wasn't just what he'd heard that affected his sleep. No, it had been what he saw. What is he looking at? Kigo asked curiously as Don Kanoji leaned forward, his face scrunched up in thought. Maybe the spirit is right there. Mizuiro suggested. Sato heard them, but he didn't comment. His mind was still playing back the loud yell he'd heard earlier when the production crew was still setting up. It sounded male, and it appeared to originate from the hospital, but was anyone capable of screaming that loud? And that was not accounting for the strange pressure he felt which had set his hairs on end. Everything went on without a hitch after that. The hospital also fell eerily silent. Until Kanoji brought out the stick. The scream, this time many octaves higher, slammed into his ears, causing him to gasp in pain as his blood turned to ice. He clutched his ears and shut his eyes in an attempt to block out the sound, but it continued to reverberate through his brain. The pressure returned tenfold, and it took all he had to remain where he was. For the first time in his life, he felt terrified and vulnerable, and he wanted nothing more than to bolt. The inhuman scream tore through his mind, stripping away at his very soul. What was worst was that the rest of the crowd continued their cheers. Didn't anyone hear the screams? He felt like he couldn't breathe, and the feeling only abated when Don Kanoji was thrown off his feet, although the screams continued. With his eyes closed, Sato was only aware of Kanoji's situation through the MC's announcements. But as the feeling of terror slowly ebbed away, he looked up to see Kanoji back on his feet and conversing with someone. "Ah, I see, so you're still my fan even in death, boy. I'm honored by such dedication." Disregarding Kanoji's words, Sato nearly failed to register the darkened shadow right in front of the spirit medium. Only when it rippled and shifted did he notice it. He stared blankly at it for a moment, but there was a sudden flash of intense light, originating from where Don Kanoji was earlier. Caught unawares, it blinded him temporarily, and splotches of light remained in his vision for a good half hour, but it had the additional effect of silencing the entire crowd. When he turned back to Kanoji, his eyes rapidly blinking to dispel the glare that seemed to have imprinted itself on his retinas, he was shocked and confused at what he saw. Where the shadow had once been now stood a vaguely human-sized figure. It looked like an image from a faulty television, the shape kept flickering, like gathered mist that threatened to disperse with a strong gust of wind, and the colors appeared to blend with each other. Nevertheless, it was definitely human-shaped, although its head was a strange orange color. Wait. Orange? Sato snapped to attention and took a closer look. The only person he knew with orange on his head was Ichigo, but it couldn't be, right? Ichigo was not next to him. And neither was Rukia. Sato looked round, but couldn't see either of his good friends anywhere. He turned back to the front. Did that mean that was Ichigo? The size of the image was about the same. And wait. There was another one, standing right next to Kanoji. It was smaller, and had no discernible color. Was that? What he didn't know was that, in a rare lapse of judgment, Rukia had ordered the mod souls into hiding instead of blending back into the crowd, resulting in Sato noticing their absence. His pondering was cut short when yet another roar, this one sounding more savage and primal, pierced his ears. This time, it was enough to make him take a step back and drive all thoughts of his friends to the back of his mind. That was, until he saw them again the next day. Lost in his thoughts, Sato found himself walking past the field of Karakura Middle School. They must have ended early, a group of students were playing football on the field. He paused to watch them for a moment. Only a moment, though. He had to pick up his bass guitar and meet up with his band. He'd always enjoyed the game when he was young, and given his stature and considerable skill, others used to want him on their team. Unfortunately, whoever was in the opposite team would refuse to play against him, so he was sacrificed as a compromise. One of the kids appeared to be running circles round the other players. A girl, from the looks of it, her hair was short, but too long to be a boy's. Didn't Ichigo say one of his cousins played football? What was her name? Kaiju? That couldn't be it. After weaving her way through most of the other players, the girl eventually lost the ball to the opposing team. But instead of chasing after it, she suddenly froze, staring off into the distance. Sato couldn't see her face, but she appeared to be slowly moving back. The other kids finally noticed her in action, and two of them approached her, only for her shout to carry over to Sato. "Get back!" she yelled. "Don't come any closer." The two kids hesitated and looked at each other, but didn't stop. "Oi, Karen," one of them called out. "What are you dash?" "I said get back." She screamed in response. "Do you want to die? If not, don't come any closer." Taken aback by the sheer desperation in her voice, Sato started approaching them, thinking that she'd spotted some sort of venomous insect or something. It was then that he noticed that the air suddenly felt thick and suffocating. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, yet he suddenly felt like his movements were slowing down, almost as if in water, and his windpipe was constricting in his throat. There was also an inexplicable feeling of dread that felt quite familiar, almost like what he felt last evening. And then he saw it. A huge distorted shadow was some distance away, and it was slowly approaching Karen. He now remembered Ichigo's cousin's name, and her friends purposefully. It looked similar to what he witnessed yesterday, only this shadow was much larger, and he could sense hunger radiating from it. "Move. Stop. Move. Stop." Move. Stop. If he didn't know any better, he would have said it was akin to a predator stalking its prey. Karen was staring right at it, so was that what scared her? He didn't know what that shadow was, but he did know that if it reached the students, they would be severely injured at best. Making an instant decision, the restriction on his movement seemed to fade as he tossed his school bag onto the ground and charged towards Karen, ignoring the feeling that his life was about to change forever. And not a moment too soon. The shadow charged at Ichigo's cousin as well with unexpected speed, but Sato had already reached her. With no time to think, he scooped her into his arms and dove forward, just as the ground where they once stood exploded in a shower of grass and soil. Not wanting to crush her, Sato skidded on the grass instead of rolling to lessen the momentum. Still, to his large, robust frame, he only felt it slightly. Stunned by the appearance of a large person and the explosion, the other kids screamed in surprise, turned tail and ran for it. Still, Sato ignored them in favor of the trembling girl in his arms. "Me, mister?" Karen asked in a mixture of fear and confusion. "Are you all right?" Sato asked, shocked at how pale and terrified she looked, but unable to do any more to reassure her as he searched for the shadow. "Mister. Please, get out, while you still can. And leave you here." "Where is it?" he asked as calmly as he could. He still couldn't find the shadow, and it was making him more nervous by the second. Whatever it was, she could see it also, and a second pair of eyes didn't hurt. You can see them?" she asked. "Just as a shadow." "So. What do you mean for them?" Karen mumbled something. "Where is it?" he asked again. They're everywhere," she whispered. Snap snap. "Oi, Heim, you're spacing out again." Snap snap. "Huh?" was the eloquent reply. Inoue Orihime snapped out of her stupor and looked at her longtime best friend, who was leaning on her broom and grinning at her. "I'm sorry, Tatsuki-chan. What did you say?" The short-haired best friend in question shook her head in mock exasperation. "I said, you're spacing out again." "Oh." Her thoughts drifted back to the reason behind her daydream, and she couldn't help but blush. Watching her intently, Tatsuki picked up on it immediately and grinned. "Oh, I see. So that's the source of your daydream." The redness blossomed on Orihime's cheeks, the color clashing with her striking burnt orange hair. "Tatsuki," she chided lamely, holding the broom. She being using close to her, as if it shielded her from the teasing that was to come. She glanced fretfully around. "It's not who you think it is." Her best friend only grinned wider. "I never said it was a who, did I?" She spluttered out another feeble excuse. It didn't matter that this wasn't the first time Tatsuki called her out over this, but that didn't make it any less embarrassing. She felt an arm drape over her shoulders. "Heim, not that I disagree with you. I'll admit, Kurosaki is attractive, even if he does look grumpy most of the time." Orihime gave her an incredulous look. "Oh, don't give me that look. I'm still a girl, despite what people might say," Tatsuki rebuffed with a cheeky grin. "I'm just not interested right now. Sides, as my best friend, I've gotta make sure no one attempts to take advantage of you." Orihime gave her best friend a smile and nod in acknowledgement. So far, she'd been asked out for a total of 9 dates. 6 had been from boys in their sophomore years and above, while 3 were freshmen as well. She hadn't been interested because, well, she was hoping someone else would be asking, but she didn't have the heart to say no to, especially to that one boy who looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. Thankfully, Tatsuki stepped in for her every time. Frankly, she didn't know what she would have done after her brother passed away when she was only 12. But thankfully, she hadn't had to find out, as Tatsuki entered her life a year later, and they've been inseparable best friends ever since. The second strongest female in Japan, with a broken arm, as she was known in Japan, had taken on the role of her protector and friend, standing up for her in situations she didn't even know she needed help in. She mentally sighed. When Oki-sensei had announced the indefinite transfer of 2 students, she'd immediately taken to the taller of the 2. It felt as if she'd seen him before, but she realized it was because he looked a lot like his uncle, albeit the different colored hair. That quickly led to her fantasizing about him as a knight in shiny black armor, storming an immense tower where she, the White Princess, had been held captive by white, horned demons that looked like bats. As such, she'd been disappointed when she eventually learnt that the girl he transferred with was his girlfriend. Despite her below-average height, she had to admit that Kuchiki Rukia was definitely pretty. She briefly considered attempting to steal him from the petite girl, but immediately felt ashamed for having such a notion. She took solace, however, in the fact that some magazine she'd read declared that 95% of high school romances ended within 3 years. Since Kuchiki and Kurosaki had been together for 1 year, perhaps they might break up soon. However, it didn't help matters when Kurosaki defended Kuchiki from Oshima Ryuki, showing his willingness to protect his girlfriend. Unfortunately, it also had the side effect of making him even more desirable. She longed for someone to fight for her like that, all the more so after that nightmare she had yesterday night. Last night, she'd gone with Kurosaki and the rest to Kanoji's live show. It wasn't that she really believed in spirits, but she liked to think that her long-deceased brother, whom she still missed terribly, was watching over her. What she did not expect to hear or see were the terrifying bone-chilling screams, which was saying something after she and Tatsuki had attempted a horror movie marathon last summer, and the grainy but distinct image of a quadruped creature about the size of a rhinoceros. She remembered seeing Don Kanoji battle it, but her mind wasn't functioning clear enough at that time for her to be certain. Tatsuki had been concerned about her, although she too looked a little uneasy. What she did remember though, was the creature's blurry but unforgettable face, as well as empty, pitch-black eye sockets which refused to let her rest easy that night. A loud crash broke her thoughts and she jumped violently with an deep, head swiveling round to look for the cause. She held a hand to her heart, earlier thoughts about the frightening creature causing her heart rate to skyrocket. Thankfully, the only one nearby was Tatsuki, who hadn't noticed her reaction. "Are you kidding me?" Tatsuki exclaimed. "We were just about done. What do those idiots think they're doing?" Copying Tatsuki's gaze, Oriheim saw what had gotten her so annoyed. The karate club equipment room's windows appeared to have exploded outwards, showering the ground below with glass. 2. 3. 4. They broke all 4. They know they aren't supposed to fool around in there. "Come along, Heim," Tatsuki said, cutting an imposing figure with her broom gripped with both hands. Oriheim blinked. "Tatsuki, where are you going?" "Wait there. I'm getting us some help," she hollered back. Oriheim couldn't help but smile. Knowing Tatsuki for so long, and judging by the vicious look on her face, she was hoping for the culprits to refuse responsibility. Standing idly for a few moments, she noticed that the school had fallen into an unnatural silence. Tatsuki had disappeared into the building, and there wasn't a single person in sight. She felt a light breeze drifting past her, but for some weird reason, it felt cold, as if it was chilling her very bones. Ignoring the sudden desire to not be alone, she decided to get started on the debris first. The first sign that something was amiss was when, a few steps later, Oriheim found herself out of breath. The next thing she noticed was that the air felt thicker, making it difficult to breathe. All of a sudden, pure, unexplained terror shot through her. There was no one around, but she felt exposed, watched. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to find cover, to do anything except stay out in the open. Something horrible was going to happen to her if she didn't move. Oriheim quickened her pace, stopping short of breaking out into a dead sprint. She only had eyes for the relative safety of the school building. Movement on top of the school building caught her attention. Not knowing she was merely delaying the inevitable, she looked up, and immediately wished she hadn't. Floating above the school roof was a creature. That was the only word to describe it. It was nothing she'd ever seen before. It had numerous huge light bluish tentacles sprouting from its center like a flower, hiding any traces of a body. And its face. The closest thing her shocked mind could think of was that its white face looked like a ghost from Pac-Man, but it had longer and more numerous appendages at the bottom. Lastly, there was no mistaking those empty eyes that seemed to bore right through her. And they were staring straight at her. "Hello, girl," a haunted, echoey female voice rang out, surprising Orihime and sending a shiver coursing through her. "You can see me, can't you?" That oh-so-familiar expression of fear. Of disgust. "It makes you look positively delicious, my dear," it said as it slowly floated down. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to cooperate. The creature didn't seem to notice her struggle, and she giggled in a high-pitched tone, making its tentacles quiver slightly as it slowly approached her. "Oh, don't worry, my dear. I won't bite. Well, not while you're alive, at least." It stopped in front of her. What are you?" Orihime whispered the 3 words that first came to mind. Yet another high-pitched giggle. "That's not very nice, is it? Perhaps you ought to learn some manners." Right at that point, a commotion over by the building entrance was enough to catch Orihime's attention. "Ow. Okay, Arisawa," I said, "OW." 2 male students, both in school uniform, burst from the entrance, falling unceremoniously onto the ground. "No buts," Orihime heard Tatsuki say, which sent a wave of relief and panic through her. "You caused it, you clean it." 3 more male students walked out, all in karategi, followed closely by Tatsuki. "You do realize you can't stop me, right?" the one in the middle said. "As the club's president, I should hope not," Tatsuki scoffed back. "It would speak a lot about the boys' karate standard. But I can walk all over your other buddies without breaking a sweat. So don't stall for time. Knowing Haim, she's probably already halfway done." "Oi, Haim." Her friend waved to her, unaware of the danger they were in. "I told you already, this is not our job. Don't take a step closer to the glass." Nearby, the creature also had its attention focused on the newcomers. Ooh, more living beings. Unexpected, but convenient. Tatsuki was heading towards her, poking and prodding the other students, but Orihime wasn't paying attention to them. "What are you going to do?" "Oh, don't worry, it's nothing much, I assure you. Though that girl is acting quite violently, I must say. Quite unbefitting." Tatsuki said as she reached her. "What did you say?" Orihime jumped violently as something poked her shoulder. She turned to see Tatsuki standing casually next to her, a hand on her hips and the other holding the broom resting on her shoulder. "Whoa, Haim, what's wrong?" She, along with the other boys, appeared to be completely ignoring the creature just meters from them. A mixture of fear and confusion swept through her. You can't see it," she whispered. Tatsuki's face remained blank. "See what?" She turned in the direction Orihime was facing. "I don't see anything." Her voice trailed off as she furrowed her brow. The boys behind her mirrored her movements, yet none of them seemed to have noticed the creature. The feeling of dread intensified as she realized that, for some reason, none of the rest could see the danger in front of them. I think a little more obedience would be good for her," the creature interjected, seemingly unconcerned with the exchange going on in front of it. "And I know just the thing," it giggled. It seemed to lean back, and its tentacles started quivering faster. "What? No. Leave Tatsuki alone." Orihime blurted out. She didn't know what came over her, but at the creature's words, everything else was shoved from her mind. She only knew that the creature had switched targets, and that target was Tatsuki. She didn't notice her friend startle at her outburst and turn back in the direction she was looking, only to frown and squint at something that caught her attention. "Oh, don't worry. I won't be doing anything to her." Can't say the same for the others though. But don't worry. You'll get your chance. In other situations, she might have felt afraid at what the creature was saying. However, that was when she suddenly found renewed use of her legs. Immediately, she reacted on instinct. With a cry of, "Tatsuki! No!" Oriheim launched herself at her friend, crashing into her and sending them both to the ground just as multiple projectiles burst from the creature's tentacles. As the last tear in the area closed and he turned his attention elsewhere, Ichigo noted that his direction of travel had taken him close to Karakura High. He wondered if both he and Rukia would still be students there tomorrow. While he needled Rukia a little about admitting she was growing fond of the place, he to admit that he was growing fond of the living world as well, living with his pseudo-family and without the demands of a captain. But staying would run the risk of being found by Soul Society. He could always go into hiding, with the Vazard, maybe, but he'd go crazy from being cooped up, even with Rukia for company. Unfortunately, it looked like the best option was to move to another town. He shook his head and focused. Now wasn't the time to bother about this. He'd already saved 3 more pluses and a number of unsuspecting living humans from being hollow prey, but the hollows were still appearing everywhere. He detected one hollow already in the school compound, with a few more approaching it. He could worry about the repercussions of Yuryu's stunt later. Something appeared to be attracting the hollows, which was never a good thing. Chapter 48, Newcomers. Mind if we join you? Sato looked up to see 2 familiar faces smiling at him. Hello, the tall, orange-haired teen said with a nod, while the girl inclined her head a little lower than him. It's the start of the school year. There's no reason to be sitting alone, is there? Sato wasn't sure of a response. He couldn't recall their names, although he remembered the guy was related to Kurosaki-sensei. The girls saved him from making a blunder by elbowing the guy lightly. Ichigo, maybe he wants to be alone. Well, I guess, but it's seldom fun being alone. The teen turned back to him with a grin. No objections with us joining you? No. It's fine, go ahead, Sato gestured in front of him. Great. But we haven't been properly introduced yet. I'm Kurosaki Ichigo. Kuchiki Rukia, the girl added. Sorry about barging in on you, but we saw you sitting up here on your own. 's fine, really. He really didn't mind, only that he hadn't really expected company. But then again, in middle school, few ever approached him, not that he'd been approachable. Thanks, he said as his 2 classmates sat down. They looked at him in slight confusion. For what? Kurosaki asked. Your help. Oh, it's not a problem. They weren't even giving you a chance to defend yourself. What a bunch of cowards, he responded. They didn't give you any more trouble, did they? Kuchiki asked. He had a brief flashback of 2 heads cracking against each other as he sidestepped them. They tried. Well, it doesn't sound like you need it, but if you want, we can always back you up, Kurosaki offered. Unsure of how to respond, Sato nodded awkwardly and settled for watching them. Kurosaki removed a lunchbox. He opened it slightly and peeked inside. Removing the cover completely, he popped a piece of fish into his mouth before passing it to Kuchiki, smirking as he chewed. Kuchiki, who'd witnessed everything, scowled and slapped Kurosaki's arm none too gently, but the teen didn't even flinch as he retrieved another box, his own, apparently. Obviously looking to retaliate, Kuchiki's hand shot out and grabbed Kurosaki's box the moment he opened it, somehow managing not to spill a single grain of rice, and transferred a piece of fish back into her lunch. Kurosaki rolled his eyes but didn't comment. Curious about their relationship since he saw them in action, Sato asked, Are you two dating? Kuchiki asked. He nodded. Yes, we are. But he dragged me along, so I'm stuck with him, whether I like it or not. She smirked and looked at Kurosaki, indicating it was merely a statement in jest. Well, it's not like you're complaining, is it? He smirked back. Besides, if I remember it correctly, you chased after me, saying that you refused to let me go alone. Kuchiki's smirk turned into a slight smile. I did, didn't I? The look on her face suggested there was more to the story, but asking any more would be intruding. The remainder of lunchtime continued with him fielding questions from the couple. While he wasn't comfortable with giving out too much information to two people he'd only just met, he liked the company. The next couple of days saw the two of them continuing to spend lunch time with him, and he found himself enjoying their presence and warming up to them. He didn't think they had any ulterior motive for befriending him, nor could he, for the life of him, think of an existing one. Hey, Sato-san. Kuchiki asked on the fourth day. Not to be nosy or anything, but why are you always alone? Some students even seem scared of you. Well, he mused, a question like was bound to eventually come out. It was a past he was ashamed of. Disgusted of. A past he was hesitant to share. But then again, perhaps it was because no one bothered to ask. By the time he'd changed, no one was willing to approach him, let alone talk to him. It was only until these two teens had approached him with an offer of friendship that anyone had bothered about getting to know him. Well, he supposed he could consider them friends. The last friends he had as a kid were before he started becoming violent. There didn't seem to be any harm telling them. But he was afraid of what they would think of him after that. When I was a kid, I was big. Bigger than everyone else, much like today. And I was strong. But I was also extremely short-tempered and violent. I bullied and beat just about every kid I knew, even my old friends, just because I could. It felt good getting others to submit, and I saw no reason to change that. Looking back, I hate what I was, but as a kid, I didn't know better. So, what changed? Kurosaki asked. My grandfather, Oscar Joaquin, adopted me when my parents died. This was when I was still in Mexico. I didn't always stay in Japan, you know. He tried to change me, teach me to be gentle, but I never listened. I thought myself invincible. That was until a group of my victims' fathers sussed out my identity and came looking for me. Sure, against a couple of kids my age, I was unstoppable. But against 6 angry fathers, I stood no chance. He rewrapped his lunch, his appetite long gone. That was until my grandfather stepped in. He was a boxer in his day. One of the best. I thought he was coming to my rescue, to teach those fathers a lesson. But he didn't. He merely stood over me, simply blocking any of the fathers from causing me any more harm. Eventually, they decided that he would suffer in my stead, and proceeded to lay into him. But through it all, he never retaliated. Not even once. He was in pain for about a week after that, but he always tried not to let it show. I'm ashamed that it took being a victim to understand what my grandfather was saying, but since then, I've been striving to be a better person. He even gave me this as a present and testament of how I've changed, he said, reaching under his shirt and pulling out a chain. On it, instead of a pendant, it had a small golden coin. An old Mexican coin, minted in sadly, the damage had been done in Mexico, none of my friends accepted me back. Your grandfather sounds like a good person, Kuchiki quietly commented. He was, Sato said wistfully, remembering the person who'd not given up on him. But he passed away, unfortunately. Oh. I'm sorry, Kuchiki hastily replied. It's fine, he reassured her. Do you miss him? Kurosaki asked. Sometimes. But I have this to remind myself of the promise I made to him, that I won't raise my hand in retaliation, unless it was to protect others. Even if your own life was in danger. Even if my own life was in danger. That's why that gang came after you, right? You stopped one of them from beating up a kid, Kuchiki interjected. But how about if there's no one to protect? Were you just going to let the gang beat you into a bloody pulp? Well. He stopped, realizing he had no answer. I've never thought of that. And that was true. He'd never had a reason to wonder about what he would do in a situation where there was no one to protect. There was silence for a while, but he didn't feel awkward. In fact, he felt oddly relieved, even if his throat did feel very dry. It was the most he'd ever spoken in a long while, but he felt comfortable around these two, and once he started talking, he didn't think about stopping. "Tell you what," Kurosaki suddenly said. "First of all, why don't we dispense with the formalities? We're your friends. There's no need to call us by our family names." He was a little surprised, but couldn't help but smile slightly at that. "Sure, Ichigo. I can live with that." "Excellent," Ichigo grinned. "Now, you were a bully once, but you've changed. And we respect that. In fact, it's quite noble of you to only fight to protect others. Still, there's a line between not lifting a hand in self-defense and stupidity. But we do understand your desire to honor your grandfather," Rukia continued. "So how about this? They're everywhere." He seldom had reason to fear anything, but the terror that leaked from the young girl's words was enough to grip at his heart. Not even the gangsters had scared him, but those two words were enough to make him fear for his survival for the first time. How many? He tried keeping any emotion from showing. I don't. 8. He had no reason to doubt her. If he squinted, he could pick out more of those faded entities. None of them seemed to be moving. What the heck were these things? Were they some sort of supernatural being? More importantly, were they observing them? Waiting for them to make a run for it? He could sense the hunger from all around him. "Everywhere," the girl said. That meant they were probably surrounded. "All right, here's what we do. Mister. Behind you," the girl pointed in the direction he was facing away from. He reacted immediately, leaping forward. With one hand, he placed the girl on his shoulder, leaving a hand free for better balance. Something slammed the ground where he last stood, but when he turned around, he couldn't see anything. In fact, he realized as he whipped his head around with increasing dread, he couldn't see any more shadowy figures. The girl screamed again. Without directions, he blindly jumped to the right, but something slammed into him. He winced at the impact, nearly losing his footing, but he quickly regained his balance and continued running. And not a moment too soon, as something struck the ground where he stumbled in quick succession. Knowing he was outnumbered, staying still wasn't an option, so he kept moving in the direction he was headed. "Where are they? You can't see them?" "Not clearly," he replied, slightly lamenting the fact that they were out in an open field. "Think you can direct me?" All right." The girl steadied herself. "Hold on to me. I'll to your left. Watch out." He banked a hard right without stopping, hearing the swish of claws behind him. Behind. They're gaining. He poured more strength into his legs, ignoring the slight protests coming from them. Left. Again, he cut right, cursing inwardly. He couldn't keep dodging forever, he had to get them out of the field, it was way too open. But the creatures kept forcing him to switch directions. It was like they were working in a pact, attempting to close him in. Right. He swerved left. No. He could barely see what she was looking at. But he could make out a huge shadow. And it was bearing right down on them, too close to avoid. Quickly, he pushed her off his shoulder. She screamed, out of fear or surprise, but he stopped her fall with his arm, the other wrapping around her body in a hug. He twisted and bent forward slightly, shielding the girl from the creature. Something slammed into his left with tremendous force, impacting his head as well. His vision exploded with stars as he was lifted high into the air. His vision blacked out for a moment, but he regained consciousness quickly, his focus swimming in and out. He registered the ground rushing towards him just before he slammed onto the hard surface. He gasped in shock as unimaginable pain erupted from his left shoulder and spread along his arm. It was enough to nearly make him pass out again, but he gritted his teeth, fighting back the nausea. It was either a dislocated shoulder or a broken one, He'd been in enough fights to recognize it for what it was, but it didn't make the pain any easier to stomach. Something warm and sticky was flowing down the side of his head, but most any pain was made seemingly non-existent from the pain in his shoulder. Sitting up, his right arm used as support, he had no choice but to let Ichigo's cousin slide off him. His left arm wasn't going to be able to support her. She slid to the ground unconsciously, probably hitting her head during the fall. But he had bigger problems right now than to bother about her. He looked around, and didn't like what he saw. The shadows were now of a darker shade and much more distinct, although he still couldn't see what they were. What he could tell, though, was that he was surrounded. Again, the creatures remained still, as though waiting for him to make a move. DMN it, DMN it, DMN it. He thought with growing despair. He'd fought bullies, thugs, armed gangsters, and the like before. He'd been beaten, bruised, and bloodied. But he'd always come out on top. But this? If it had just been one or two, he could have tried fighting it. But against this many? Creatures this big shouldn't be able to move that quickly. Added that he could barely see them, he'd probably get ripped to shreds in no time. There was no mistaking it. He was going to die. And so was the girl. But what about the promise he made with his two close friends? Let's make a promise, shall we? Rukia suggested. You fight for us, and we'll fight for you. What do you mean? He asked in confusion. You can't expect to take on the gangs by yourself, can you? Especially not if they get smart and use tapers dash. Tasers, Ichigo interjected. Fine, tasers, against you again. So, we'll cover your back when you run into them again. In return, all we need is for you to watch ours. He was stunned and, dare he say it, a little touched as well. Not that I'm thankful, but I've seen you two fight. You don't need me defending you two. Surprise is one of our advantages, Ichigo replied. Especially for Rukia. No one expects her to pack a deadly punch. Without that advantage, it'll be harder for us. So. What do you say? That's right. He made a promise to Ichigo. He didn't know her, but she was his cousin. That was good enough for him. Curse his luck for running into these supernatural creatures, he supposed. Whatever they were, he wasn't going to survive. And by extension, neither was the girl. But she was Ichigo's cousin. The least he could do was go down fighting, his head held high, instead of lying there pathetically. He got unsteadily to his feet and stood over the girl. His left arm remained bent across his chest, it was pretty much useless now, and any movement guaranteed a world of pain. His senses on overdrive, he felt something stuck to his chest. Using his good hand, he reached up to touch the item, and instantly recognized the rough surface of the Mexican coin that belonged to his grandfather. Peeling it off his sticky skin, he clasped it tightly in his hand. Come on, you monsters, he growled to himself. Releasing the coin, he steadied himself as best as he could. A shadow darted forward. With their lives on the line, he did the only thing he could do, and threw his fist forward with as much force he could muster. His fist connected solidly with the shadow, and there was a brief spike of pain as brilliant green light exploded from his fist. Tatsuki. No. Oriheim launched herself at her friend and tackled her, just as multiple projectiles burst from the creature's tentacles. The projectiles missed them completely, but they struck the 5 karate students. All 5 fell to the ground in cries on pain. The remaining projectiles sailed across the courtyard, smashing through most of the visible windows and disappearing from view. Immediately, she scrambled off her spluttering friend, searching for the creature. A flash of panic surged through her when she couldn't find it immediately. The tackle must have disoriented her, as the creature didn't seem to have moved at all. Its tentacles were quivering slightly, almost as if in amusement. Heim, what are you doing? And what happened to the rest? You don't see it? Oriheim asked, confusion reigning. She'd reacted instinctively to save Tatsuki, but she was at a loss of how to stop, or escape from, this creature. What was going on? It was there as plain as day. Why couldn't Tatsuki see the creature? This was bad. If Tatsuki couldn't help. Huh? See what? You're starting to scare me. What are you talking about? Tatsuki's head swiveled between her face and the direction she was looking at. And what happened to the rest? But. It's right there. The thing with the huge tentacles. She cried, her desperation and frustration growing. It shot some sort of seed out, and it hit them. And. It's useless, little girl, the creature chortled with its haunting, echoey female voice. Your friend cannot see or hear me. But as it spoke, Tatsuki's head snapped forward. Who said that? Did you hear that? Hear what? That voice. Something about someone not seeing or hearing. Relief flooded Orihime. So Tatsuki could hear it. But. Why was she looking around? The creature's expression didn't change, but its blank face suddenly seemed more sinister. Oh. This is interesting. A human that can hear me but not see me. Tatsuki leapt to her feet, and Orihime followed suit. Who's there? Show yourself. She demanded, hands up in a defensive position. I think you two are going to be quite delicious. It ignored Tatsuki. After all. The feistier a girl is, the prettier her face becomes when it contorts into tears. The creature waved a tentacle, and movement nearby caught Orihime's eye. She turned and saw the 5 students slowly getting up. A cry of fear escaped her lips when they stood. All 5 of them had blood flowing from where they were hit with the projectiles. 2 had been hit in the chest and 1 in the shoulder, staining their uniforms a dark crimson. 1 had been hit on his arm, bathing it red, while the last one had his hair completely matted in blood. Silence dominated for a moment. The 5 students just stood there, their bodies swaying slightly. Orihime wanted to go over, to see if they were all right, but every muscle in her body refused to move again. Tatsuki suddenly slid next to her. Oi, Yamada, she called out to the club president. Are you all right? Then, all 5 students looked up, and Orihime's heart seized up in panic and she screamed. All 5 students were staring back at them with black, soulless eyes completely devoid of any color. Their skins were deathly white and their faces were frozen with a pained look on their faces. Something's wrong with them. Get behind me, Tatsuki said urgently. She complied, but her gaze kept swiveling between the creature and her 5 schoolmates. But. What about that? It doesn't appear to be doing anything for now, but help me keep watch. You can see it? But I thought I can only see a faded, distorted figure. But yeah, I can see it. Sorry about not noticing it earlier, Haim. I don't know if it'll attack me while my back's turned, so I'll need your help here, alright? Orihime nodded numbly, but the creature heard them. Oh, don't worry about me. I don't really enjoy fighting. In fact, you could say I dislike it. Besides, I prefer something more entertaining, wouldn't you agree? It's been a long time since I've seen 2 beautiful girls get murdered by their own peers. It waved another tentacle, and the doors of the school building burst open. More students emerged from the building, all of them with the same pasty white skin, hollow eyes and frozen expressions. They were heading straight for the 2 of them. Stay back. Tatsuki yelled as the 5 karate students lurched towards them. She received no response. I said stay back. Oh, this is going to be so entertaining, the creature positively giggled at that. Now. It flicked yet another tentacle. Get them. Sato opened his eyes, a bright green spot still burned into his vision. He appeared to be standing. That meant he wasn't dead. Which was good, right? He blinked once, twice, trying to avoid the sting caused by the dust that's been kicked up. What just happened? He remembered attempting to punch some supernatural creature he couldn't see, which caused a flash of pain, and that explosion of green light. He looked at his right arm, and had to blink again to confirm that he wasn't seeing things. Instead of the fairly dark skin he'd inherited from his Mexican descent, his entire arm was now completely black, with a dark magenta stripe running down the length of his arm. There were two wing-like protrusions on opposite sides of his forearm, and there was a two-pronged extension upwards past his shoulder. It made his arm look half times thicker than before. If he hadn't known any better, he would have said it was a well-designed, elaborate prop. But it didn't feel like a prop at all. He could feel something encasing his entire arm, but instead of being restrictive, it seemed to meld with his arm, like an extension of it. The brief spike of pain was gone, replaced by a feeling of power pulsating from his arm. Some sort of armor, perhaps. He clenched and unclenched his still smoking fist. Everything seemed fine. He glanced at his injured left arm. It was still uselessly held across his chest, and did not have the same material encasing it. However, he didn't feel any pain flaring from it, merely a dull throb, detectable only if he concentrated. He tried moving his entire arm. There was a slight discomfort when he tried, and failed, to move his shoulder, but at least his other joints felt fine. In fact, not only did he not feel any pain, his mind felt clear and possibly flowing with energy. His vision, which had been hazy, was sharp and in focus. In short, he felt great. With a jolt, he suddenly remembered where he was, and he quickly jerked his arm up in defense. He wasn't prepared for the sight before him. Instead of the shadowy, distorted creature that had attacked him, there stood a large two-legged creature. It looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Its skin had a bluish tinge to it, and it had what looked like a mask on its face. The mask had a hungry, maniacal grin on it, and could easily be the stuff of nightmares. In fact, it was more apt calling it a monster instead. But what caught his attention was the monster's body, or lack thereof. There was a perfect circle-shaped hole in the middle of its chest, a clean cut right through such that he could see behind it. And instead of having two arms, he saw no trace of one arm. Instead, there was only a bloody stump from which dark red blood poured freely onto the ground. Shocked, Sato stared numbly at his encased hand. Did he do that? It was then he realized he could also see the other shadow creatures that had been chasing him. Just as he sensed earlier, they had surrounded him. Running would have done little good. They all had similar white masks on their faces and perfectly circular holes through some part of their body. But that was where the similarities ended. Some were smaller than the first creature, others significantly larger. Some resembled actual animals, others some sort of grotesque entity. And they were all staring at him through black, empty eyes. There was no time to ponder though, as the injured creature roared and gnashed its teeth. An alarm sounded in his head, the creature was going to attack again. He braced himself, but instead of fear, he felt a sense of anticipation bubbling and rising from within him. He was still hopelessly outnumbered, but with this strange material on his arm, maybe, just maybe, he would be able to walk out of here alive. The injured creature charged at him, but instead of the blinding speed he expected, its movements seemed slow. Sluggish, even. Feeling a rush course through him, Sato sidestepped its outstretched arm and aimed a punch at its body, striking with all his might. It was like punching through rotten wood. His fist connected with the creature's bluish body and went right through. Blood blossomed and sprayed from his fist, drenching his arm and splattering parts of his body. The force sent the creature flying high and over the other creatures, before landing in a heap and not getting up. Viewing the effects of this strange armor for the first time, Sato paused in surprise. Even his strongest hit against the gangsters who'd picked on him never generated that kind of effect. But he was forced to abandon admiring his handiwork, as more creatures suddenly lunged at him from all sides. The flash of fear he experienced quickly evaporated as he realized that once again, their movements were slow, completely unlike 5 minutes ago, where he could barely see them, let alone keep up. Crouching, he grabbed Ichigo's cousin by the back of her shirt with his injured arm and pressed her against him. He then charged forward and began engaging the monsters. Against opponents he could now see, he had no trouble laying into them. He ducked and weaved, easily dodging their slow movements, and every hit that connected was devastatingly strong. Punches breached the creature's skin in an explosion of blood. Backhand sent them flying. A strike to the back of one monster's neck saw its head snap back at an unnatural angle. In another situation, he would have balked at harming, let alone killing, anything. But these creatures were out for his blood, as well as Ichigo's cousins. Furthermore, these creatures appeared to be some sort of supernatural abomination, and it was kill or be killed. There was no question over which option to choose. Finally, it was down to only one monster. Sato faced it, aware of the fact that he was panting heavily and he felt completely spent. Taking out the rest apparently took more out of him than he expected. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to focus. There was only one left. He could rest after that. The monster had half an arm missing, but it was definitely not down for the count. It circled him like a wary predator, looking for an avenue of attack. He followed its movements, braced to react the moment it moved. Suddenly, it froze. A moment later, a blade suddenly burst from its forehead. Time seemed to freeze as Sato stared at the blade in shock and confusion. Then, the blade retreated through the wound it created, pulled out by the mystery assailant. The monster gave off a pained roar as it finally collapsed, revealing the person who'd come to his aid. It was the last person he expected. Rukia, he blurted out in surprise. Indeed, standing over the fallen monster was his classmate and good friend Kuchiki Rukia, with a sword that was completely white in color in her hands. But what was she wearing? Instead of the school uniform, she was wearing a black kimono. And where was Ichigo? She looked up at him with a hint of confusion before her eyes swept across the field at the other monsters. "Did you do this?" He nodded, too winded to reply. "Are you okay?" she asked with genuine concern. "I'm fine," he panted out. "But her. Karen." Rukia quickly rushed over. "What happened?" "I think she hit her head or something." Now that it wasn't needed, he transferred her to his right hand. He felt a stab of pain from his shoulder again, but tried not to let it show. But she wasn't fooled. "What happened to your arm?" "Just a scratch," he said dismissively. Rukia looked ready to call his bluff, so he quickly added, "What were those things?" She looked like she knew what the monsters were, and with the danger gone, the fear and determination in him was replaced by an immense curiosity. "There." She paused. "You know, I think I'd better explain later. I need to get you two somewhere safe." "Come on," she tugged on his arm. With little choice, he complied. He'd taken a couple of steps before he suddenly felt a splitting headache. His vision turned hazy, and his legs nearly gave way. "Sato," he heard Rukia call his name, but his ears felt blocked, like she was calling him from another room. "I'm fine," he slurred. He tried to take another step, only to feel his body lurch forward. He tried to put out a foot to stabilize himself, only to feel the strength leave his legs. The last thing he saw was the ground rushing towards him and someone calling his name before he blacked out. Ichigo stood on the school roof and surveyed the school courtyard in dread. The entire area was littered with unconscious students. At least none of them appeared dead, there were no pluses around. There was also a hollow, or two halves of one, lying a distance from the students. What happened here? He scanned the motionless students, zeroing in on the unfamiliar Ryatsu that had burst to life when he intercepted another pack of hollows. It was much fainter now, but he honed in on its source. It belonged to a girl. One with orange hair. Oh shit. Inoue-san. Quickly, he leapt deftly off the building and rushed over to her. She too was motionless, but he could sense a faint Ryatsu emanating from her. If anything, it proved she was alive. He spared a glance at the dismembered hollow and wondered how in the world she had managed that. But another important question was, what to do with her? He couldn't leave her here, lest another hollow came by. You know, a voice spoke, and he tensed and spun round. It's rude to stare at another girl while she's unconscious. It might just create the wrong impression. Yoruchi stood nearby, regarding him with a smirk. What the hell? Yoruchi-san, I wasn't staring. Sure doesn't look that way to me. Ugh. He shook his head. Never mind. Did you do that? He indicated the hollow. She shook her head. No, that was entirely her doing. It appears that Inoue Oriheim had some latent powers within her that were manifested in this hollow invasion. That's new. I've never heard of humans having spiritual powers before. And the Quincy doesn't count? He scowled. Him. I'm beating the Quincy out of him when I see him again. Yoruchi didn't reply. She walked over and knelt down to inspect his unconscious classmate. I'll take it from here then. You go on ahead. They're all fine, right? No one got eaten by the hollow. He looked round. It did something to them, yes, but thankfully no one was killed. And as far as I know, there are no lasting effects. All right then. Focusing outward, he quickly identified more hollows and sped off towards them. A blue streak of light drilled through the hollow's leg, severing muscle and tendon alike. The sudden loss of its leg saw it crashing to the ground. It roared and got up, but a second streak punched through its mask, permanently downing it. Yuryu cursed and flicked his right hand. Movement caught his eye. He turned and was forced to duck as another hollow pounced. He twisted round, drawing his bow and firing as it sailed over him. The arrow bored through the hollow's torso, exiting through its mask. It was dead before it hit the ground. Senses still on high alert, Yuryu flicked his wrist again, sending speckles of blood flying. The rush of air made his fingers ache. He clenched his fist, attempting fruitlessly to numb the pain while ignoring the warm liquid drenching his palm. My fingers are starting to slip, he picked himself up with a grimace. And my shots are steadily losing power. This can't be right, he said to no one, speeding off to the next cluster of hollows. It's been almost an hour, and I've killed at least 1,000. The hollows should at the very least be letting up by now. He glanced at his right hand, where his fingers had been sliced open by the prolonged repeated use of his bow. DMN it. At this rate, I won't be able to keep up. I nearly missed that last hollow. I might not be that lucky the next time. He immediately kicked himself for such a thought. Stop whining, you idiot. He berated himself. I have to win. I have to avenge my sensei. Doing his best to ignore the pain, he moved on to a nearby swarm of hollows. This group was amassed at the edge of a neighborhood. It was by far the largest group he'd faced so far. They flooded the area, a chaotic mess of bodies. They appeared to be merely milling around without a purpose, and not actively hunting, as if they were waiting for something. Something seemed amiss. But in his haste, he disregarded it. Bow drawn, he waded into the hollows. In response, the hollows turned their attentions to him. They surged forward like a wave of death, crashing forward like a demonic onslaught threatening to swallow him. But he stood his ground, firing off shots as quickly and accurately as his blood-soaked hands allowed. But fatigue wasn't something he could deny any longer. His movements had slowed considerably, any faster would start becoming harmful, and each pull of his bow sent jolts of pain shooting up his arm. Each shot was also no longer able to pierce through multiple hollows. He snapped off 2 more shots before he was forced to back up a few steps to give himself some space. DMN it. There's too many of them. He thought angrily. But I can't retreat. They're currently focusing on me. If I run, they'll target other innocents. He mustered up as much power as he could, readying another barrage. But before he could shoot, a dark blue wave of energy suddenly exploded from his left. It completely engulfed the hollows that were closest to him, swallowing them whole and without a trace. When the energy faded, a large area before him was now clear of hollows. And beyond that, even more were encased in solid ice. He turned towards where the energy came from, and was surprised to see Kurosaki stalking towards him, his face a mask of anger. His face was splattered with blood, though there were no visible wounds. Any blood on his black kimono was indiscernible, but beyond that, he looked none the worse for wear. A flash of Ryatsu where the hollows were gathered revealed Kichiki's whereabouts. In his weakened state, Yuryu could feel the Shinigami's power flowing from him, seemingly making the air thicken. That, coupled with the furious look sent his way, sent a chill through him, and he wondered for a brief moment if he'd stirred up a hornet's nest. "Kurosaki, are you so desperate that you need to poach my kills?" he asked nonchalantly, trying not to reveal any emotion or show how drained he was. Kurosaki didn't reply. He walked straight up to him, right in his face, and fixed a silent glare at him for a full 5 seconds. Yuryu saw the punch coming, but couldn't react in time. His punch connected solidly with Ishida's face, and Ichigo heard a satisfying crunch of bone as his head snapped back. To the Quincy's credit, he stayed on his feet, and was only knocked back a step. Yuryu clutched his nose and stared at him in surprise, but Ichigo wasn't done. He reached out and grabbed his white outfit. "Are you happy?" he snarled, shaking Yuryu none too gently. "Are you happy that you got to play your stupid little game?" Yuryu visibly gulped, but his eyes remained hard. "It's not a dash. Bullshit. It's a stupid little game that does nothing except confirm my predecessor's opinions about Quincy." Yuryu spluttered, but glared back defiantly. "What is this rubbish you're spouting?" "Rubbish?" His mind flashed back to the torn body of the young plus, and he had to restrain himself from slamming the teen to the ground. "How about the fact that the hollows that you brought here killed at least one plus, possessed 100 of our schoolmates, and DMN near killed one of our classmates?" Yuryu's face paled and he opened his mouth. But he must have seen something in Ichigo's expression, because he wisely shut it again. "Who?" he choked out. "Inoue-san, that's who. And who knows how many others that Rukia witnessed, that neither of us witnessed. You're so focused on your revenge, your hissy fit against Shinigami, that you're willing to let others suffer for that. Now tell me, doesn't that sound like the Quincy of old that you supposedly disagree with? I didn't dash. Doesn't it? They were so hell-bent on revenge against the hollows that they didn't stop to think about the long-term effects. In fact, in a sudden brainwave, Ichigo raised Zangetsu and pointed the tip at Yuryu's throat. How do I know you actually disagree with your ancestors, How do I know you're not actually working behind the scenes to annihilate the Shinigami by destroying both worlds? You're a Quincy. I'd bet you actually agree with what they're doing, don't you? I mean, all the Quincy are the same. So tell me why I shouldn't just run this blade through your throat and end the Quincy once and for all. What? Yuryu finally found his voice and raised it. I'm doing no such thing. You're accusing me of this crap. I don't even know what's happening. The hollows should have stopped emerging 10 minutes ago. Ichigo stared at Yuryu for a good few seconds. Because that right there is your entire argument against us. Satisfied that he'd made his point, he released Yuryu with a slight shove. He staggered back and stared at him, but it wasn't a look of anger. I'll say it again. We have nothing against you or the Quincy. In fact, your actions Ichigo. Rukia suddenly appeared, running towards him. What is it? He turned to her. Something wrong. It's hard to explain. They're just standing around and not doing anything. They don't even react to my presence or when I attack them. He frowned. I don't follow. I think you better see for yourself, she pointed at the mass of hollows. He glanced at Yuryu briefly. The Quincy was just standing there, a slightly defeated look on his face. Satisfied that he wasn't going to try anything, he refocused on the hollows. Sure enough, they were all standing still, ignoring the 3 Ryatsu-filled beings that were standing nearby. What the hell? There's like more than 100 of them. Even more came when you two were talking, faster than I could kill them, Rukia replied. But they didn't bother attacking me, they just stood there while I cut them down. They all seemed to be looking at something. Indeed, all the hollows were looking skyward. But when the 2 of them looked, they couldn't see anything. It was only approaching evening, but the cloudy sky was darkened till it almost looked like night. It was as if the sun decided to stop shining. Suddenly, noise broke out from the crowd of hollows. Wah. The hell? Rukia asked. It sounds like they're chanting something, Ichigo agreed. It was a sound that was completely unfamiliar to either of them, a low, unbroken tone that seemed to grate at their ears, like a song with no discernible tune. And it was getting louder by the second. Wait, up there. Rukia pointed at the sky again. Ichigo copied her, and immediately realized that things had taken a serious turn. It was a tear. A huge tear, of a size he'd never seen before. Like a cloth, it was as if someone had folded the darkened sky in on itself, creating a pitch-black crease that looked about as wide as their school building. It was pulsating violently, as if someone was trying to rip the sky open, spilling whatever horrors it contained out into the open. They're summoning something. Rukia exclaimed. Sheet. As if we haven't had enough problems. He shifted into a 2-handed grip on Zangetsu. Come on. I'm not in the mood of sticking around to see what they dredge up. When Rukia nodded, he immediately turned to Yuryu. Oi, Ishida. Are you just going to stand there or help us? He seemed to come out of a trance. What? Stop gaping like an idiot and follow us. The hollows are calling out something and I'm not waiting about to find out what it is. He yelled. The chant was becoming deafening enough that he had to yell just to make himself heard. Yes, but dash. Will it stop that thing? Ichigo completed his sentence. Probably not, but like hell I'm going to stand back and do nothing. Ichigo. He heard Rukia call urgently. I'm starting without you. He turned. Go. I'll catch up. But she'd already taken off, Zanpakuto in one hand and a Kido spell forming in the other. He looked at Yuryu. Quit stalling, you idiot. Wasn't this what your grandfather wanted? To work together with Shinigami instead? Well, guess what? We're working together now. Or would you rather stand there and undo the work he did? That finally got his attention. Like hell I will. His look of confusion and anger became one of steeled determination. He raised his left hand, and his bow once again materialized in it. He drew his bow and sent an arrow accurately through a hollow's mask. Over here, you hollows. The last Quincy, Ishida Yuryu, is your enemy. He yelled as he took off. Ichigo immediately took off after him. He still wanted to give him a good thrashing, but this'd have to do for now. They reached Rukia, who had already frozen a large group of hollows and was currently engaged with multiple opponents. But even as they approached, numerous hollows broke off and charged, while the rest continued. They're chanting. What? There weren't this many when I first arrived, Yuryu called out. If you'd been listening, Ichigo shot back. You'd know why. But let's even the scores a little. He leapt into the air, picking out a location away from the others. Getsuga dash, he pulled his Zanpakuto back. Tensho. The powerful wave that emerged roared towards the ground, crashing into the middle of the hollow swarm. It outright obliterated all who were caught in its path and killed those close enough. But yet more broke off their chanting and rose to target him. Below him, Rukia unleashed another burst of her second dance. Ice surged forward in a cone shape, freezing even more hollows in one fell swoop. Ishida, obviously not wanting to be outdone, had his bow spitting out arrows at blinding speed. Despite his rash, and quite frankly stupid challenge that he still had to answer for, Ichigo had to credit him for his endurance and pride. He'd noticed the Quincy's bloodied hands and fatigue earlier, but the latter still continued pushing himself. Working together, the hollow numbers quickly dwindled in numbers. But all of a sudden, the chanting stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. But this silence was shattered as a resounding crack reverberated through his ears. What the hell was that? He called out. Turning skywards, he realized what had changed. Distracted by the hollows, Ichigo hadn't noticed that the tear was now aligned vertically. But even as he watched, two gigantic hands, each as big as a large hollow, suddenly burst through the tear. The hands gripped opposite sides of the tear and prized it open like a curtain, revealing a gigantic hollow. But it wasn't just any hollow. Sheet. A Minos. Are you kidding me? He cursed. Ichigo. Rukia suddenly appeared and ran towards him. It's a dash. I can see it, he exclaimed. But what's one doing here? He watched as the enormous hollow stuck its head out. With a low roar, it started enlarging the hole, revealing more of its body. Its mask, like its body, was huge and had an elongated nose. Its body on the other hand was hidden beneath a large, deathly-looking black cloak. It must have been either the huge concentration of beings or Ishida's bait. Something attracted it here. Kurosaki. What's going on? What is that thing? Yuryu asked, worry evident in his voice. Strangely, Ichigo found himself smiling with excitement. That, Ishida, is a type of hollow known as Minos. Jillian class to be exact. A Minos, what's that supposed to mean? I've never seen any hollow that big. That's because it's not exactly a hollow, Rukia explained. A Minos is a composite entity, created by the combined power of hundreds, even thousands of hollows. Combined? What, they fuse together? Could we talk about this later? Ichigo quickly cut in. I'm not going to let this abomination stay any longer in the living world. He clasped both hands tightly on Zangetsu's tsuka, ready to charge forward. At that point, the remaining hollows were taking to the air and heading towards the Jillian, presumably to rally around it. But the Jillian opened its gaping maw of a mouth, and its tongue whipped out. Like a spear, it knifed through a line of hollows, impaling them on its bladed tongue. The tongue snapped back, taking the hollows with it. The Jillian's jaws clamped shut behind it, staining the ghostly white mask red. Like the others, the cannibalistic scene before him was enough to make Ichigo pause. It eats them, Yuryu gaped. It eats them, Rukia confirmed. The tear was now large enough for the Jillian to move through, which it did, revealing two pointed feet wrapped in bandages. Each step it took made the ground tremble slightly. Again, it opened its jaws, scooping more hollows into its gaping maw. But as it shifted away from the tear, they were shocked to see another Jillian emerging. Sheet. Another one. Yuryu shouted, and he immediately fired off a shot at the first Jillian. His aim was true, the arrow connected with the mask. But instead of drilling through, the arrow shattered like glass and dissipated. It didn't even cause a scratch. Yuryu whispered in shock. We told you earlier, Ishida. This isn't your average hollow. It is made up of, and has the power of, hundreds and thousands of hollows, Ichigo replied. But I've never heard of such creatures before. Doesn't make them any less real, does it? Rukia shot back. Ichigo, there's two. You think we can take them on? Supposedly. I've never fought one before, but there shouldn't be a problem. Don't underestimate them, and I'll step in if you run into any problems, okay? Of course there aren't going to be any problems, she smirked at him. Ichigo returned the smirk and turned to Yuryu. Ishida, your competition is over. You're not in any condition to fight those Jillian now, so don't interfere, understand? What are you talking about? I can still dash, Yuryu began, but stopped when Ichigo pinned him with a glare. In case you haven't noticed, you're currently fighting to stay on your feet while I still feel fine. And that's not forgetting the fact that I'm still set at you. So I'd suggest dash. Ichigo. Watch out. It's a Zero. Ichigo whipped round the moment Rukia screamed his name, just in time to see the first Jillian with its jaw wide opening and a ball of brilliant crimson light growing within. Sheet, he cursed. It wasn't every day that a Shinigami found himself facing a Minos. Even he, in his time as a captain, never came up against one. But he knew about them, read about them in the textbooks. And he learned about the destructive power of a Zero, that its explosive power was more dangerous at close range. Heck, he'd already experienced it firsthand back when he was trying to subdue his inner hollow. If this Zero held the same AMT of power, he was going to have his work cut out for him. Go! Go, he shouted at Rukia. Don't let the other one fire off one too. Not needing to be told twice, Rukia disappeared. From his peripheral, so did Yuryu, right as the Jillian fired. He could feel the power behind the Zero, and he was relieved and a little disappointed to find that it was weaker than he expected, and slow enough to avoid. But he couldn't be certain of the amount of damage done if he allowed it to hit the ground. So he went with his only option. Releasing the control he kept on his Ryatsu, Ichigo powered up. The flow of energy flooded his body, and he felt reinvigorated. He raised his Zanpakuto and braced himself. The Zero slammed into it with great force, threatening to blow it out of his hands. But Ichigo was more than a match for the Zero, and Zangetsu held firm. He found himself grinning with relish. This was his first time fighting a Minos, a class of hollows said to be so dangerous they could kill, or at least seriously injure, even the most powerful of Shinigami if they weren't careful. But ultimately, he'd faced worse when fighting his inner hollow. With a yell, he unleashed a burst of Ryatsu and pushed back the Zero. The ball of red energy sailed skywards towards the Jillian. But Ichigo didn't stop there. He leapt up, racing after the deflected Zero. He shot above the Jillian's large head, and its big, dead eyes followed, tracking his movement. The Zero struck the Jillian in the face, exploding in a brilliant flash of red, and it lurched back in a roar of pain. Seizing his chance, Ichigo channeled Ryatsu to his Zanpakuto, focusing on the cutting edge. Then, with all his might, he hacked down on the Jillian. He clashed against a Ryatsu barrier, creating a flare of dark blue Ryatsu as he tried to overcome the Jillian's barrier. He felt the Jillian's Ryatsu resisting his efforts, acting as a shell, its main defense to compensate for its low speed and maneuverability and partly why they were deadly against lower-leveled Shinigami. Ichigo was anything but. His Zanpakuto quickly broke through the Ryatsu shell and into the Jillian's head, cutting right down the center of its head. He didn't stop until he reached the ground, creating one long gash that ran right down the hollow's head and body. He leapt away from the Jillian, still maintaining a guarded stance. The large hollow seemed to freeze for a second before blood suddenly began spurting out along the entire length of the cut. Then, with a horrible squelching sound, the Jillian separated into two halves. Each half fell at opposite directions before crashing to the ground. It had been cut cleanly into two. Now sure it was dead, Ichigo lowered his stance. He spared the dead Minos a final glance before turning away towards the other fight, ready to step in if he had to. He was just in time to see Rukia let fly with her second dance. Frigid winds exploded from her Zanpakuto, freezing the air it traveled through as it roared up towards the Jillian's head. The hollow's head was caught square in the attack, encasing it in ice. His interest was perked when Rukia unexpectedly hopped onto the ice and started running up the slope it created. When she reached the head, she leapt into the air, spinning round to face skywards. The white ribbon trailed after her, emphasizing the gracefulness of her movements. Then, to his slight confusion and interest, she drew a white circle above her. He didn't need to hear her voice, echoing clearly into the silent night sky, to recognize that move. Some no mai. Her voice was drowned out slightly as the Jillian broke free from the ice with a loud crack. Before it could move, the white circle was filled with a glaring white light. Hakuren. She sped away as a huge blast of icy air cannoned downwards. It engulfed the hollow completely, and struck the earlier formed ice with enough force to shatter it completely and replace it with its own. As the mist cleared, he was impressed to see that the Jillian had been completely turned into an ice sculpture, surrounded by stalagmites of ice. The ground around the hollow was also frozen solid. It was overall an impressive show of power and a testament to how much more powerful she'd gotten since arriving in the living world. He had to cut short his admirations when Rukia suddenly fell onto her knees. "Rukia," he called out as he hurried over, concerned that she'd suffered some unknown injury. Those concerns were allayed when he reached her. Aside from panting heavily and having to supporting herself with her zanpakuto, she didn't appear to have any visible injuries. Rukia looked at him with a slight grin. "I'm fine, you idiot. Just drained. I kinda poured quite a bit of power into that last attack. I'm not really sure it's dead though." She looked at the frozen Jillian then back at him. "You want to do the honors? You sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. I don't have enough energy for another one." "All right then," Ichigo nodded, hefting his zanpakuto onto his shoulder. "That was awesome work by the way. I knew there was a reason why I love you." She shot him a glare that was quickly rendered useless by the smile that crept onto her face. "Go," she said with a weak shooing gesture. "Stop wasting time. I think I've killed more hollows this past hour than I have my entire life." Nodding in reply, Ichigo took a few steps forward with Zangetsu raised. Then, he yelled, "Getsuga Tensho," for what he hoped was the last time today. The familiar arc of dark blue energy sailed through the air and exploded against the lower half of the frozen hollow. Huge chunks of ice splintered off, scattering in all directions. Each piece shattered and disintegrated without a trace as gravity reclaimed them. With most of its lower body cut off, the rest of the hollow was sent toppling over. Likewise, it burst into pieces, spraying the frozen ground with pieces of iced hollow. And finally, after over an hour since the invasion began, silence reigned over Karakura town. "That's it?" Ichigo called out. "Come on, I'm still good for another round." He received no response, not that he expected one. He couldn't sense any more hollows, and no more new tiers were forming. Shrugging in mock disappointment, he resealed his zanpakuto and sheathed it before turning back to Rukia. "What?" He grinned innocently at Rukia's slight exasperated look. She rolled her eyes. "If I wasn't that depleted of energy I'd smack some humility into you." Ichigo just laughed and offered her a hand. She grasped it gratefully and pulled herself back up. "Thanks. Don't mention it," he said, pulling her into a brief but tight hug. "You've really gotten a lot stronger. That was an impressive display. Didn't know you could use Sodi no Shirayuki that way too." "I could say the same for you as well," Rukia replied. She looked at the remains of the Jillian that Ichigo had fought and made a face. "Ugh, brutal." "Yeah, well, I was still feeling sad at Ishida, so I kinda took it out on the Minos." "And now?" Ichigo let out a deep breath. "I'm still sad at him, but I don't have the urge to bash his face in any longer." They both looked back at Yuryu, who still had his bow out and was staring at them in awe. "Wonder. You doing alright, Ishida?" Ichigo asked coolly. As upset as he was at Yuryu, he wasn't about to turn him away if he needed treatment. Yuryu looked at him, and for a moment, appeared to want to say something. But his expression eventually turned stoic. "This doesn't change anything between us," he said defiantly before disappearing. The two of them stared at the spot he vacated in silence. Ichigo was the first to break the silence. "What am I going to do with him?" He sighed. "Well, his actions definitely affected the entire town, not to mention the hollows he permanently erased from existence," Rukia pointed out. Ichigo's smile faded as he remembered one of his biggest concerns about taking up Yuryu's challenge. You know what this unfortunately means, don't you? Rukia nodded solemnly. Yeah, we can't stay here. If the Hollow invasion didn't attract the attention of Soul Society, two Minos definitely will. But, she trailed off. He didn't need to ask to know what she was thinking. Frankly, he felt the same way. He too had grown fond of Karakura town, and not counting the same surname, the Kurosaki household had been like the family he never had. Yuzu and Karen had both adopted him as an older brother, a role he quite willingly accepted. And despite the Kurosaki patriarch's questionable sanity, he had wormed his way into the role of father. But in the end, they didn't exactly belong here. They were Shinigami, they weren't technically alive. They couldn't expect to stay here indefinitely among the living unless they isolated themselves like the Vazard. They would have to move on eventually, be it back to Soul Society or somewhere else in the living world. For now, let's get out of here. We can decide on our next course of action later. Someone from Soul Society is bound to be on their way by now. As they moved briskly away from the battleground, a voice suddenly called out, "And just where do you think you're going?" They both froze in surprise. The voice, though one they hadn't heard in about 2 years, was instantly recognizable to the both of them. They turned. Sure enough, standing up in the sky was Kachiki Byakuya, along with 3 other Shinigami they recognized as well. Their night was just about to get worse. Chapter 49. Ichigo clenched his jaw in shock and anger at the sight before him. Standing in the air before him were not one, but 2 captains, Kachiki Byakuya and Ikamaru. Standing off to either captain's side were 2 of their old friends, Renji and Inuzuri. Byakuya was as impassive as ever, his stare not showing a shred of emotion. Ikamaru still had his trademark wide, thin-lipped smile plastered on his face. Eyes open to just a small slit completed his reptilian gaze. Inuzuri, like Byakuya, was staring at them stoically. His blonde hair looked slightly longer than Ichigo remembered, but his left bang still covered part of his face. However, instead of matching Byakuya's blank stare, his eyes were flitting between the both of them in confusion and sadness. As for Renji, having grown up with him, Ichigo immediately recognized the anger hidden behind the forced smile. It was directed at them, although he wasn't exactly sure why. The tense silence was broken by Renji. "Well, this is interesting," he sneered, the grin on his face never faltering once. "We were dispatched to the real world to investigate a swarm of hollows, and what do we find? A wanted former captain and his third-seat accomplice." "And hello to you too, Renji," Ichigo said as calmly as he could. "It's been a while." As Renji glowered at him, something on Renji's arm caught Ichigo's eye. Immediately, he recognized the armband that symbolized someone of the vice-captain rank. It was the same one he'd worn when in the 6th. A similar accessory was affixed to Izuri's arm, indicating they'd both become vice-captains during their 2-year absence. Judging by where they were standing, Renji had taken up his old position as Byakuya's subordinate, while Inuzuri was Ikamaru's vice-captain. This was bad. Very bad. The palpable tension and general hostility meant that they were unlikely to walk away without a fight. While he'd never fought Byakuya outside of training duels in the past, he was fairly confident he could at least match the noble head. He'd never seen Ikamaru fight before, except when he was still an academy student, but the Division III captain was surely no slouch. Faced with either of them, he was confident he could take them on. But 2 of them? He wasn't that sure of their abilities to be certain. Furthermore, he'd already expended most of his power against the swarm of hollows. If a fight were to get prolonged, as it likely would, he'd already lost. Similarly, while Rukia could likely take on Renji or Inuzuri, or maybe both at once, she had expended almost all her energy. In other words, faced with opponents of this level at full power, they had a huge disadvantage. "Well, in that case, hello, my dear friends," Renji grounded out through clenched teeth. "How has your vacation been?" Rukia answered before he did. It's been quite fun, actually, she shot back. I suppose congratulations are in order for your promotion. Yours too, Izuru. Renji's gaze shifted to Rukia, and Ichigo noted that his expression lost some of its anger briefly. Got it about a year back, he replied tersely, though with a hint of pride. Not that you would have bothered anyway. Ichigo grimaced inwardly at the bitterness of those words. Even before their exile to the living world, Renji had already been slowly drifting away from them. It wasn't entirely his friend's fault. While Renji made excuses for not joining, neither of them made much effort to include him as well. Very frequent training sessions were his most used excuse, which Ichigo knew was unlikely. He knew how Zaraki Kenpachi operated his division. He would leave his men to train on their own, and join whenever he felt like it. It was usually Ikaku or Yumachika that conducted training sessions, but even those weren't done every day. Yachiru. Well, safe to say, she never seemed to do anything. She was either hitching a ride with Kenpachi or wandering Soul Society for someone who was willing to play with her. That still didn't explain why Renji had started avoiding them. He had his suspicions, but with his time taken up by the 6th Division, his then growing relationship with Rukia, and his eventual captaincy, it hadn't been a priority. Hello, Izuru, Rukia continued. Can't say we're all that happy to see you under these circumstances. Izuru's swiveling gaze stopped on her. No, can't say it is, he replied. I see. Is Hinamori doing well? Last I remembered, you both were in contention for vice-captaincy in the 5th. A small smile played on Izuru's face. Yeah, she's now Aizen Taishu's vice-captain. She's loving her time there. There was another brief silence before Ichigo redirected his focus to the remaining newcomer. Wasn't Matsumoto your vice-captain? He asked the smiling captain. She was, Ikamaru continued to smile. But she transferred back. Said she needed to help the kid run the squad. The kid? Toshiro? Ichigo asked in mild surprise. Right in one. He made captain, didn't Chano? A little green, but nothing a little time can't handle. Ichigo nodded. It made sense for Toshiro to take over his place. The younger Shinigami would have made captain had he not defeated him in the captain's proficiency test. I see. Well, has Izuru been dash? Enough of this sheet. Renji suddenly interrupted. He drew his Zanpakuto as he charged straight at Ichigo. Ichigo immediately reached behind his back to grab his Zanpakuto, bringing it forward to meet Renji's vicious swing. Both blades clashed in a burst of sparks, and he was surprised at the amount of strength Renji had poured into the attack. Obviously, he meant business. But the moment their blades clashed, Renji's scowl turned to shock. He inclined his head to the left, and leapt away as Rukia's blade knifed through his position. Skidding to a halt a distance away, he looked back at them blankly before directing his attention onto his left arm. It sported a cut-down part of his forearm, and already it was bleeding freely. Rukia? He spluttered, either out of shock at being hit or that Rukia had attacked him. And just what do you think you're doing, Renji? Rukia growled. Droplets of blood peppered the cutting edge of her still-released Zanpakuto. The red-haired Shinigami scowled. What do you think? There is a warrant for Kurosaki's arrest. Using my family name now, Abarai? Ichigo shot back. I'd like to see you try. Renji's face twisted into a snarl. It'll be my pleasure. Ichigo shifted into a defensive stance as Renji charged. Abarai. The deep voice of Byakuya, though soft, cut through the silence, and Renji halted in his tracks. Taicho. You are letting your emotions affect you. Renji looked confused for a moment. How so, Taicho? Byakuya raised an eyebrow. In your emotionally induced haste to attack Kurosaki, you failed to notice Rukia waiting to intercept. And indeed she'd been. Moments before Renji attacked again, Ichigo noticed her feet shifting slightly. That slight shift would have allowed her to propel straight into Renji's path. Although mere feet away from Ichigo, both of them immediately noticed Renji's dismissal of her once he focused on Ichigo. Neither wanted to hurt their friend, but he was giving them little choice. However, Byakuya too noticed his subordinate's error. His face starting to match his hair color, Renji turned to stare at Rukia again. Emotions flitted across his face, surprise, anger, confusion, and sadness. I shall handle this, Byakuya continued as way of dismissing Renji. Turning to Ichigo, he said, Kurosaki Ichigo. By order of Central 46, you are under arrest for experimenting with hollows, conducting experiments on yourself, and subjecting citizens of Rukongai to such experiments. Furthermore, you are charged with attempting to acquire hollow powers. You are to be brought back for further questioning. Any attempts to resist will be met with by force. Ichigo glanced at Ikamaru to gauge for a reaction. There wasn't, but allowed his gaze to cycle past Renji and Izuru as well. He couldn't let slip his knowledge of both his and Aizen's involvement. And what do you think, Byakuya? He asked the noble clan head. Do you think I'm responsible, or capable, of this? The response took a couple of seconds longer to arrive. My thoughts about this are not important. Which means you think I did not do it, he continued to prod. Look at me. Do you think I look like a hollow right now? I have it under control. Byakuya continued to stare at Ichigo for a while. Regardless, the charge still stands. It is for Central 46 to decide on your sentence. Then, dismissing him, he turned to Rukia. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before soldiering on. Kuchiki Rukia. By order of Central 46, you are under arrest for aiding the escape of Kurosaki Ichigo, who is wanted for illegal hollow experimentation and illegal attempts to acquire hollow powers. You are to be brought back for further questioning. Any attempts to resist will be met with by force. Another tense silence followed. The two of them looked at each other, uncertain of the best course of action. While it wasn't stated, both knew that Ichigo would ultimately be executed for having hollow powers. Rukia, while innocent on that count, would be charged for helping him escape. Well? Byakuya prompted. Ichigo was torn. He knew Rukia was prepared to fight to ensure his safety, he was sure of it. That's pretty much what he'd do if their places were reversed. On another day, he'd fancy their chances, especially considering the fact that she'd likely achieved Bankai. However, she was still drained, and so was he to a lesser extent. While he didn't know how much stronger both Renji and Izuru were now, they were unlikely to be pushovers. And even then, there were still two captains to contend with. Even if they didn't kill her, she might end up killing herself if she continued pushing herself. He knew she knew her limits, but that wasn't going to stop her. And he couldn't let her do that. She nodded at him, steely determination in her eyes. He returned the nod, knowing how hard it was to defy Byakuya for his sake, and he loved her all the more for it. As Rukia looked back at her brother in resolute defiance, Ichigo steeled himself for what he knew he had to do. I'm sorry, Nisama. Rukia said, her voice only wavering slightly. She gripped her Zanpakuto harder, as if to draw comfort. They will kill Ichigo if you bring him back, and I won't let you do it. Perhaps expecting that answer, Byakuya's expression didn't even slip. I see, he said with closed eyes. In that case, you leave me with no choice but to dash. Wait. All eyes focused onto him as he called out. Rukia whipped round, shock and confusion on her face. What are you doing, you idiot? She hissed at him. Even Byakuya seemed surprised for a moment, although once again it slipped off his face just as quickly. Ignoring Rukia, he continued. I will turn myself in, but on one condition. Let Rukia go free. She aided my escape in an emotionally charged spur-of-the-moment decision, and should not be punished for it. The reactions of the four Shinigami might have been comical on another day. Izuru's blank reaction changed to one of wide-eyed shock. Renji was no longer scowling at him, but looked as if he thought Ichigo was crazy. Ikamaru was no longer smiling, and Byakuya was looking at him contemplatively. Rukia's reaction was expectedly the worst. Once she recovered from his unexpected announcement, she rushed up to him and slapped him hard. He expected Rukia to try knocking some sense into him, but it was still hard enough to make him take a step back. When she pulled back for another slap, he caught her arm. "Ichigo, what the hell are you saying?" She hissed urgently, pulling her hand out of his grasp and grabbing a bunch of his kimono. "You may have your hollow self under control, but that won't matter to them once they detect hollow Ryatsu in you. They'll kill you." "Then what do you suggest then, Rukia?" "Escape. We have to go through the four of them. We can take them." "We can't, and you know it. Neither of us has enough energy to last for long in a fight. Your hollow powers burns through my reserves even faster. So, what, am I supposed to just stand back and let them take you back?" Her voice was rising in anger. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, Rukia," Ichigo said, trying his best to maintain his composure. "If we were at full power, I'd willingly take them on with you, but I'm not about to let you unnecessarily harm yourself through overexertion in a battle we both know we can't win." At this declaration, Rukia deflated a little and her grip on his uniform loosened. "I have to try. And you can. Rest, restore your energy, and come get me when you're at full power or something," he said softly with a grin to reassure her. No use broadcasting that they were already planning a jailbreak. Besides, if they're putting me on trial, they're not going to kill me immediately. Rukia pondered for a moment before sighing in defeat. "I don't like this." "No one said you had to," he replied, placing a hand over hers in comfort. "Neither do I, you know." She looked up at him, her amethyst eyes glistening slightly. "Idiot." She smiled. "I have every confidence in your abilities," he chuckled. Giving her hand a squeeze, he turned back to face the four Shinigami, who until then had been watching the scene before them. Or at least 3 of them were. "Do we have a deal?" Byakuya stared at him for a few moments before looking at Rukia. "As the head of the Kuchiki noble clan, Kuchiki Byakuya, shall exercise the right to punish Kuchiki Rukia, a member of my house, who has broken the law, in place of a ruling by Central. I hereby sentence Kuchiki Rukia to exile from Soul Society. She is not to set foot in Siriidii until such a ruling is rescinded by either me or the next Kuchiki head." Turning back to Ichigo, he said, "Is that to your satisfaction?" Not knowing such a thing was possible, Ichigo didn't respond until Byakuya continued. "Upon return to Soul Society, I shall inform Central 46 about my ruling as head of the Kuchiki clan. In that case, that will be acceptable." "Very well then. Please sheath your Zanpakuto and approach us. Continued wielding or subsequent drawing of your Zanpakuto will be perceived as attempting to withdraw from the deal and will be met with by force." Nodding in understanding, Ichigo returned his Zanpakuto to its scabbard on his back. He turned to Rukia. She no longer looked upset or angry, instead watching him with a fierce determination. "I'll be waiting," he said, bending down to kiss her lightly. When he tried to pull away, she grasped the neck of his kimono and pulled him back, deepening the kiss. Obviously, she didn't care that Byakuya was watching. Although surprised at her boldness, Ichigo responded in kind. "I won't be long," she promised when they finally pulled apart. "Don't forget to watch out for Aizen and his cronies," Ichigo whispered before straightening up to his full height. With a final glance at Rukia, he marched over to the waiting Shinigami, taking a grim satisfaction to Byakuya's distinctively annoyed look. "Abarai, open the Senkamen," Byakuya ordered as Ichigo reached them. "Hi, Taicho," Renji responded before proceeding to act as ordered. He stabbed thin air, and the familiar double shoji doors appeared in front of them. The doors opened, its interior glowing with a misty yellow light. Beyond it laid the passage back to Soul Society. Behind them, Rukia watched as Izuru and Ikamaru, who was lamenting the lack of anything interesting, proceeded to stand on either side of Ichigo. Every muscle in her body was screaming at her to act, to unleash Sodi no Shirayuki on the group, take Ichigo, and make a run for it. How could she just let them take Ichigo without a fight? Both of them knew the only thing that awaited Ichigo back in Soul Society, death, real death. But she desperately clamped down on this instinct, knowing exactly what Ichigo had done. Their best chance was for both of them to unleash their Bankai, but she was at her limit. The simple act of releasing her Bankai would use up the last of her Ryatsu, but that fact alone wouldn't have been enough to stop her. Ichigo knew that, and stopped her before she could do it, and very likely kill herself in the process. Byakuya moved behind him, surrounding him on all sides. With Renji leading the way, Ichigo was escorted towards the Senkamen. However, just before Renji could step through the doors, a blue bolt streaked past Rukia, heading for a direct hit at Renji's head. Hiding behind a wall, a lone figure watched. Exhausted, embarrassed, and thoroughly chastised, he could still feel the last vestiges of irrational rage and anger probing at his rational mind, threatening to seize control of his thoughts. An anger that had been burning much more fiercely just mere seconds ago when he was forced to retreat with his tail between his legs, the gulf in power being shoved in his face. But his rational side had fought back, bombarding him with the indisputable fact that he'd started it, and had evidently bitten off more than he could chew. 2 baits had been overkill, he admitted, and it was never his intention to attract the attention of hundreds of hollows. If Kurosaki hadn't stepped in, he would have been torn to shreds by the deathly swarm. Furthermore, he acknowledged the truth behind Kurosaki's words, his thirst for revenge had robbed him of all considerations about the danger he was placing Karakura town in. And while it was a low blow, Kurosaki was right. Picking fights with Shinigami was bound to unravel the very relations his grandfather had painstakingly tried to push for. Instead, by fighting by Kurosaki and Kuchiki's side, the effect on the hollows had been devastating. Perhaps this was what his grandfather meant by working alongside the Shinigami. His thought processes were rudely interrupted when he suddenly sensed 4 unfamiliar huge Ryatsu signatures appearing close to where he'd left Kuchiki and Kurosaki. Alarmed at the possibility of more hollows appearing, he suppressed his own Ryatsu to undetectable levels and retraced his steps. As he approached the open grounds, caution took over, and he hid behind the walls of a nearby house and watched the scene unfold before him. Immediately, the white garments 2 of the figures were clad in stuck out like a sore thumb against the dark sky. Still, the black kimonos were not hard to discern. More Shinigami. And, if he remembered his lesson with his grandfather correctly, the 2 Shinigami in the white garb, a Haori, were captains. Briefly, he wondered if either Kurosaki or Kuchiki were captains, neither had been wearing Haori. But something was off. Kurosaki and Kuchiki looked to be on their guard even as they conversed with the newcomers, as if they were expecting a fight. Unfortunately, he was too far away and could only hear a few snatches of the conversation. Then without warning, the Shinigami with outrageously red hair charged at Kurosaki, who blocked it easily. Then he was forced back as Kuchiki attacked him. This time, more heated words were exchanged, and he caught the word. Kurosaki's arrest. Kurosaki's words just mere hours ago sounded in his head. If you must know why we're here, it's because we're in voluntary exile from Soul Society. Could he have been telling the truth? The thought of coming to their aid crossed his mind. What surprised him the most was not the thought itself, but the fact that he was seriously considering it. At the very least, they'd come to his aid. Shouldn't he do the same for them? They had proven to be less cold-hearted than the Shinigami who'd left his grandfather to fend for himself. Also, he recalled seeing Kuchiki falling to her knees after fighting that huge hollow. A Jillian, they called it. She was evidently tired, and Kurosaki was too to a lesser extent. It hadn't even been 10 minutes since then. He couldn't be certain how they would match up against these newcomers, but the presence of 2 captains placed them at a distinct disadvantage. But the years of hate he'd harbored for Shinigami was not something he could just overlook that easily. Part of him still screamed at how wrong simply thinking of helping them was, and kept urging him to bolt. He looked down at his left hand, at the Quincy cross dangling on his wrist by a metal chain, ready to be summoned at a mere thought. His right hand, however, was a different story. His first 3 fingers were caked with blood, the skin sliced apart from prolonged use. Gingerly rubbing them together resulted in white-hot pain shooting through his nerves. He cursed and hit the wall with his remaining good hand. With his fingers cut up and the adrenaline ebbing away, he doubted his ability to even fully draw his bow. He turned back and silently watched the group. "Grandfather. What should I do?" he thought to himself. "They helped me when they could have just left me to die. I feel obligated to help, but I feel like I'm letting you die in vain. And I can't even draw a bow properly now." Feeling hopeless, all he could do was turn back and watch, and was surprised as Kurosaki sheathed his large sword. None of the newcomers made a move, and his confusion grew when he bent down to kiss Kachiki. That confusion grew to shock as Kurosaki walked steadily over to the newcomers. Was he turning himself in? As the other Shinigami moved to surround Kurosaki, the red-haired Shinigami turned round and stabbed thin air, causing a pair of shoji doors to materialize. With a start, he realized that the doors probably led back to Soul Society. He had to make a decision on whether to help now. But the voice of hatred still continued voicing its objection. Or maybe it was simply returning the favor. Yes, that could work. After all, Kurosaki saved him. He was simply returning the favor. After that, they were even. Throwing caution to the wind, Yuryu summoned his bow. Kuchiki and Kurosaki might be running out of energy, but he was pretty much in the same situation. Moving out of his hiding place, he summoned Raishii into his hand to form an arrow. In his current state, he couldn't hope to take out any of the Shinigami. But if he made his shots count, he could create a diversion long enough for Kurosaki and Kuchiki to escape. Pain laced through his arm as he drew the bow, but he bit back the cry that was lodged at his throat. The group still didn't seem to have noticed him, so he gritted his teeth and took aim. And let fly. As the arrow lanced towards Renji's head, Rukia instantly recognized what it was, and who it came from. And despite the circumstances, she still found herself instinctively crying out, "Renji. Watch dash." But her cry died on her lips as the arrow streaked past Byakuya, only to suddenly ricochet backwards, as if hitting a brick wall. It fell to the ground before shattering and dissipating into thin air. Her sudden cry caused all heads to turn towards her. However, Byakuya and Ikamaru's gazes were focused on someplace behind her. "I'm impressed," Byakuya drawled calmly. "That you had the guts to challenge us with that level of attack." Rukia followed their gazes, and sure enough, Yuryu was slowly approaching them with the same purposeful gait as before, his pure white robe still stained with the blood of hollows. His bow was gripped tightly in his left hand and held across his body, ready to be brought up at a moment's notice. "Ah, so you did sense me," Yuryu replied smugly. "I was beginning to worry about the standard of the Shinigami." "A Quincy?" she heard Ikamaru say. "Now that's something you don't see every day." Despite the deathly hostility directed at him, Yuryu continued to march forward calmly. "As you please. I do apologize for my intrusion, but I just happened to be passing by," he replied in an amicable tone that could rival Byakuya's. "And I couldn't help but overhear your discussion." "Ishida, what the hell are you doing?" Ichigo called out, voicing Rukia's exact thoughts. "Ignoring." "Ichigo," he continued, "now I couldn't care less if you Shinigami were to kill and eat each other, but the fact that you're in this town makes it my problem." No one responded. They were all looking at Yuryu as if they couldn't tell if he was stupid or supremely confident in his abilities. Rukia was also wondering if he had somehow lost a few screws. Appearing undaunted, he continued, "And seeing how you're forcing one of your kind to return with you when he clearly does not want to, it just doesn't sit right with me." At this point, Yuryu drew his bow and aimed it straight at Byakuya. "So I'll only say this once. Release him, or I'll make you." Rukia was dumbfounded. What in the world was Yuryu trying to pull? Did he really think he could win against any of them, let alone 4? What's more, he appeared to be struggling to keep his bow steady, and his initial attack had been repelled so easily. He was clearly bluffing, but why? Unsurprisingly, Renji spoke first. Who the hell do you think you are? This is an official Shinigami issue, and you are interfering. You can't possibly stop us, so. He drew his Zanpakuto and pointed it at Yuryu for emphasis. Back the hell off, or suffer. Man, you sure talk a lot for someone of your level, Yuryu taunted. How about we put that to the test? Why you dash, provoked by his taunts, Renji drew his Zanpakuto and strode towards Yuryu. By the look on his face, Rukia could tell for certain that Renji had every intention of killing Yuryu. Renji, wait. Ichigo called out. He didn't make any sudden movements though, as both Izuru and Ikamaru were still on either sides of him. Renji gave no indication he'd heard him. Abarai Renji, he sneered at Yuryu. Remember that name, because it's the name of the one who'll cut you down like a dog. To his credit, Yuryu didn't back down. He trained his loaded bow onto Renji, but his confident demeanor was betrayed by the sweat glistening on his forehead and the slight strain in his expression. Ishida Yuryu, he returned. The Quincy who'll show you how weak Shinigami really are. She knew that she was supposed to be furious at Yuryu right now. After all, he was in many ways responsible for their current situation. But she couldn't find the time to get angry now. Once again she was trying to clamp down on the urge to launch a surprise attack and escape with Ichigo. If they clashed, Yuryu would get slaughtered, and there had been enough bloodshed today. Renji pulled back his Zanpakuto. Horo. No, Renji. Leave him out of this. She yelled, moving to place herself between the both of them. Zabima dash. Stand down, Abarai. Renji paused mid-swing, irritation clear in his expression at being stopped a second time. Taicho. Engaging against this enemy would be not worth the time. He is clearly weak, and struggling to even maintain his stance, Byakuya coldly stated. Staining your blade with the blood of an unworthy enemy would not be advisable. Surprised at the coldness of his words, Rukia glanced back at Yuryu. He too seemed stunned at the casual dismissal. Renji scowled, but he lowered his Zanpakuto. Seeing no further objection, Byakuya continued, Come, we have no further business here. And without sparing either Rukia or Yuryu a second glance, he headed back towards where Izuru and Ikamaru were still guarding Ichigo. W8. Yuryu shouted, all manner of composure gone. Raising his bow, he called, I'm still here. Don't you dare, Urk. Seeing that he was going to persist, Rukia charged towards Yuryu and planted a fist into his gut. Gasping from the hit, Yuryu sank to his knees, doubling over and wheezing in pain. At the same time, he released his shot, but it ended up planting itself into the ground. Are you stupid? She hissed at him. You would have stood no chance against any of them. Did your brain get damaged so badly that you'd give them an excuse to kill you? Still coughing and hacking, he didn't reply. Turning around, she saw the 4 Shinigami take up their original positions around Ichigo. This time, they approached the still open portal unopposed. Before they entered, Ichigo turned round. His eyes sought hers, and with the same smile he usually reserved for her, he gave a firm nod. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes of the trust he had for her and her abilities, for he was essentially entrusting his very survival into her hands. Suddenly wondering if letting Ichigo surrender himself was a wise idea, Rukia nevertheless returned the nod. I won't let you down, Ichigo, she promised softly to herself. As Ichigo vanished into the portal, Byakuya paused and turned round, almost as if he'd heard her. His stoic, piercing gaze fixed on her, and Rukia blinked. If she hadn't known him, she would have sworn that he'd given her a barely perceptible nod. But before she could decide if her eyes were playing tricks on her, Byakuya had already disappeared through the portal. With a thud, the shoji doors slammed shut and faded from view, leaving Rukia standing alone in the silence, with just an injured Quincy for company. A figure blinked into existence next to him, but he didn't have to turn to know who it was. "They've gone." The person nodded. "And they've taken Ichigo too." "They left Rukia though." Bayabo invoked his rights as a clan head and exiled her. "Did he? I wonder why." He cursed silently, but kept his eyes on the two unconscious figures lying before him. "You know she's going to want to go rescue him. Something which I'd expect no less from her. In fact, I'd wager they chose this as the best course of action." "You're probably right." He turned himself in after only a brief skirmish with one of the Shinigami. He frowned. This was going to be problematic. "Where is she?" "Resting in the other room." "And the Quincy?" "He left. Turns out he was trying to give Ichigo an opportunity to escape, or so he says. They both looked ready to attack each other before I intervened and brought her here. According to him, he was acting as a distraction, but according to Rukia, he wasn't obvious enough." He nodded but remained silent. "You're not planning on stopping her, are you?" "Of course not. At least not without telling her why." "This creates another problem though." "Which is?" "The concealment process isn't completed yet. The Hogyoku can still be detected." "But how?" "It's been almost 2 years. It is, for lack of a better expression, resisting concealment. It's almost fully concealed, but can still be detected by someone who knows what to look for." "So that means?" "Yes. He will be able to detect it. And he will try to extract it. Which means finally making his move. I suppose the silver lining is that removing it wouldn't harm the concealing body." "Are you certain about that?" "Of course. I don't want Kurosaki coming after me. Or both of them, come to think about it. Perhaps we should have intervened." "Perhaps. But word of our presence would eventually reach Aizen, if he doesn't already know. Who knows what he'll do then? In any case, we now need to secure Kurosaki, alive of course, and hopefully prevent Aizen from securing the Hogyoku in the process." "I suppose you want to include these two too?" "Not particularly, but yes. A new world has opened up for these two, one where the slightest misstep will spell their end. It is a world they don't belong in, but it is one they are now pretty much a part of it. And with what I fear is to come, we'll need all the help we can get. But don't worry, I won't force them if they wish to back out." Just then, the huge teenaged boy stirred and coughed slightly. "Ah. If I'm not mistaken, the boy's about to wake. In that case, I'll speak to her." "You'll speak to them?" "Until they understand enough to make a choice." She didn't know what to feel. Well, she was certain she could feel, but she didn't know what she ought to feel right now. One thing was certain though, she was restless. With Ichigo being taken back to Soul Society for his trial and likely execution, it felt criminal for her to be resting now, even if she knew it was the only thing she could do. With the adrenaline fully bled out of her system, her most pressing concern right now was her plan of action. But in the quiet, doubt was starting to creep in, and now she realized the quite frankly insurmountable odds against her. It seemed like such a good idea at that time, it now no longer seemed that way. First, she had to rescue Ichigo. That in itself didn't seem all that daunting, but it was basically her against the entire Godiai. As much as she'd grown in power now, she was just one Shinigami. How could she hope to go up against the leaders of the Shinigami? On the other hand, Ichigo's life depended on her. Giving up was essentially killing him, and this was after he placed his confidence on her. She'd rather die than fail him. She looked up as the door opened. In walked Yoruchi. "How are you feeling?" the lithe woman asked. Upon seeing her most recent mentor, Rukia had a sudden brainwave. Her training with Yoruchi had been primarily on speed, with combat a close second. There was no need to attempt plowing through enemy forces if she could make use of stealth. She could sneak in, grab Ichigo, and make a run for it. But her excitement quickly deflated. It sounded so easy, but there were way too many what-ifs to account for. Her chances of getting detected were still extremely high despite her improved speed. Lousy, she eventually replied truthfully. And still exhausted. Her Ryatsu was recovering steadily, and Tessai-san had promised to return with enough food to speed up the recovery process. Oh. How so? So Rukia found herself outlining her main concerns to Yoruchi, including her doubts about being able to succeed. I would gladly go up against anyone in my way, but I'm going up against Shinigami I know, and what they're capable of. I can't feel as confident as I'd like because I know exactly what I'm up against. Shaking her head at her subdued rant, she looked up at Yoruchi, only to find the former captain smiling slightly at her. Silly child, you think we're letting you go back on your own? She looked at her in surprise. You're coming along. Of course. Yoruchi grinned. Thought I'd tag along and say hi to some old friends. Haven't seen them in a while, you know. Oh, was all Rukia could manage, slightly embarrassed that she hadn't considered recruiting others along. She'd somehow gotten it in her head that it had to be a solitary mission. Yes, oh, Yoruchi laughed. You think I'm gonna let you have all the fun? She didn't really have a response for that, so she shifted focus to something that had been eating at her earlier. Why did you only intervene after Ichigo had been taken away? With your help, we could have easily escaped. At this, Yoruchi sighed. Believe me, we strongly considered doing so. But as awful as it might sound, Kisuke and I decided that we couldn't reveal our involvement just yet. Rukia felt a flash of anger. What was so important that they had to risk Ichigo's existence for their own benefit? But for now, she retained her composure. Why? She asked, not bothering to keep the ice from her voice. At least Yoruchi looked apologetic as she sat next to her. Because doing so will inevitably reveal our whereabouts to Aizen, and we cannot predict his actions once he does know. As you may recall, Kisuke was able to stabilize Hirako and the others when Aizen experimented on them, using an object of his own creation. Their transformations were so unstable that they would have otherwise lost themselves to their hollow selves. Obviously, Aizen became aware of Kisuke's success at stabilizing them, so he sought to acquire this object. As a result, when we entered into exile, Kisuke hid it from Aizen's prying eyes. Although that was a century ago, Ichigo's transformation suggests that Aizen has still been unsuccessful in creating a stable Shinigami Hollow hybrid. Therefore, it is safe to assume he still seeks to acquire it. By revealing ourselves, word would eventually reach him, and we cannot predict what he'd do once he learns of our location. Rukia sighed, knowing that she had a valid point. I don't like this, she said heavily. Neither do I, her mentor conceded. But that's why I'm coming along. Least I can do is to help bust him out, wouldn't it? At that point, Tessai entered with a tray loaded with food. Feeling starved from her drained energy, she had to swallow hard to refrain from drooling. She thanked the large man as he set the tray down. Yoruchi glanced briefly at the large man before getting up. Well, I'm pretty sure you still have loads of questions, but let's continue this after you've rested, shall we? Wait, would it just be the both of us? Of course not. I dare say more will soon join us. For now, eat up and replenish your energy. And don't worry, Yoruchi added. We'll get him out. 2 hours later, Rukia found herself being roused by Yururu from her deep slumber. Exhausted, she had fallen asleep almost immediately, only to be awakened after what seemed like just a few minutes. But still, the short nap did wonders, and she felt fully alert. Still tired, but alert nonetheless. What is it, Yururu? She asked. Urahara-sama wants to see you in the main room now, the demure girl squeaked out. So that I can smack him for waking me up so soon, she thought in annoyance. Okay. Tell him I'll be over in a few minutes, she settled on replying. After Yururu left, she laid back down for a full minute before reluctantly getting up and heading for the room they always used for their meetings. Upon opening the room, she found not 2, but 4 people looking at her. Kuchiki-chan. Inoue-san. Rukia replied back in surprise. What are you doing here? I don't know. Urahara-san said he'd tell us what was going on, but we had to wait for someone first. I didn't know it was you. I think I know why, she returned Sato's nodded greeting before continuing. Although I don't understand why you're both here. Was it about that monster? Her eyes widened with surprise. What monster? The monster that attacked me and Tatsuki. Monster. A hollow? Orihime nodded. That's what Urahara-san called it. What happened? Wait, you could see them. The realization suddenly occurred to Rukia. She looked down to see that she was still in her Shinigami robes. You can see me? Indeed she can, Kuchiki-san, Urahara interrupted. Both she and Yatsadora-san, as you've witnessed before, seem to have latent spiritual powers within them. As a result, hollows that emerged near them were attracted to them instead of you. Again, Rukia felt dread and anger returning at the actions of one Ishida Yuryu. Was anyone hurt? She looked at both of them. Not that I know of, Sato replied. Well. Orihime began uncertainly. Yes, but I don't know. She looked at Urahara. Not to worry, Inoue-san, the shopkeeper said, although his words were directed more towards Rukia. That hollow that attacked you certainly had unique abilities, but the students it controlled are all perfectly fine, and as far as we can tell, will suffer no lasting effects. She relaxed slightly. And how about the rest of Karakura? Do you want the good news or the bad news? Rukia merely fixed a glare on the shopkeeper, letting him know that his attempt at lightening the mood was ill-timed. Ah. Right, of course. He grinned innocently. Thankfully, no living person lost their lives. And the bad news? A total of 7 pluses that escaped detection through various means were discovered and consumed. Rukia ran a hand through her hair and sighed heavily. That's about as good as I could hope for, I guess, given how many hollows showed up. Just shy of 1,008, to be precise. 1,000, sheet. No wonder Minos were attracted, she gave a half-shocked laugh. Hell, with that number, that few casualties is nothing short of a miracle. Completely avoidable, but a miracle nevertheless. Ah. Orihime started, only to jump when 3 pairs of eyes swiveled towards her. Sorry, but I don't understand. What did Kuchiki-chan mean when she asked if I could see her? And what are pluses? And spiritual power, and... She trailed off timidly. Oh, my apologies, Inoue-san, Yatsadora-san. Kuchiki-san and I got carried away there. Yes, I promised to explain everything, didn't I? But before that, Kuchiki-san, please take a seat, Urahara gestured at the cushion next to Sato. Now, before I start, I would like to add that at any point during my explanation, you are welcome to leave. This created looks of confusion in Orihime and Sato. Rukia, on the other hand, merely frowned, wondering where Urahara was going with this. Why? Sato asked. To put it bluntly, you two are gifted. You have a power that is extremely rare among the living. It is what we've termed as spiritual power, and the both of you have a considerable amount of it. They were hanging on to his every word, so he carried on. However, this power opens up a new world, one that, as you two have experienced, is fraught with dangers and full of creatures looking to kill you for that power you possess, and without a second thought. Their eager looks changed to one of horror, but Urahara carried on. Unfortunately, there is no way for me to sugarcoat this. While I can help you both, doing so puts you two in more danger than you can imagine, and even with my help, there is no guarantee that you might survive. With Urahara's speech not directed at her, Rukia studied her 2 classmates. Sato was staring at his right arm, his face otherwise betraying no emotion. Orihime, on the other hand, had a look of intense thought on her face. So, now that you are aware of the dangers, are you willing to stay? Urahara asked again. Note that this isn't your final chance to pull out. You can continue listening and back out later. There was silence for a moment. Those creatures, the hollows. There are more of them? Orihime asked. Indeed there are. Of course, there exist others that fight them off. Well done if it helps me defend others. I guess I'm in, she finally replied after a few more seconds of contemplation. Urahara nodded and turned to Sato. I'm in, he replied simply. At that, Urahara smiled. Excellent. He clapped his hands and rubbed them together. Now we can proceed. This could take a while though, but bear with me for a bit. Now, as you know, these monsters that you encountered are known as hollows. Where they come from is not important right now. What they feed on, however, concerns you too. You see, they feed on two things, spiritual bodies, or spiritual power. Spiritual bodies are essentially souls of living things that have passed away. Souls exist? Sato asked. Indeed they do. When a living thing dies, its soul is released from its living body, and will remain in this world until it is sent on. How? I'm getting to that. Anyway, hollows are able to target these souls because they're no longer connected to a living vessel, which is why they normally won't target living beings. On the other hand, hollows have an even stronger attraction to spiritual power. It's like a delicacy to them, plus they are spiritual beings as well, hence it increases their own power. That's why, although you both are alive, the spiritual power within you is what attracted the hollows to you. A few hours ago, certain circumstances resulted in a huge invasion of over 1,000 hollows. While almost all of them were taken care of, some broke off and targeted you too. They were attracted to the spiritual power within you, something neither of you knew of nor could HRNSS. Am I correct in assuming you both couldn't see the hollows at first? He was met with two nodding heads. Ordinary living beings with no spiritual power wouldn't be able to see hollows, but your powers allowed you to. While they were still locked, you could only barely detect them, but once your powers were unlocked, you could see them clearly. Are you following so far? He asked with a smile. The both of them looked a little confused, but nodded their heads. This is quite a lot to take in at once, and this casual talk about life and death can seem overwhelming, so I understand that you're both confused, Urahara said. However, a living person possessing spiritual power and being able to use it while alive is rare, almost unheard of, in fact. Training with it could put a physical toll on your body, which is why I'm here to help, should you still choose. So a soul will stay in the living world until it gets sent to the afterlife. This is done by other souls as well. However, these other souls have spiritual power as well, and are trained to defend themselves and others from these hollows. These people are known as Shinigami. At that moment, Rukia noticed Sato's head turning slightly in her direction, but he remained silent. All spirits and Shinigami reside in the afterlife, which is known as Soul Society. The Shinigami also have their own military organization, known as the Godei. They help control Soul Society and repel and hollows that may appear. Shinigami mostly stay within Soul Society, but they can get sent to the living world to help souls cross over and to kill any hollows that might threaten them. Of course, they don't stay in the living world forever, just for a few days or weeks at a time, and interaction with the living is kept to a minimum. Think of it as guard duty in the living world. Urahara nodded at her, seemingly satisfied that her two classmates understood, so she took over from there. She took a deep breath before speaking, wondering what their reactions would be like. Inoue-san, Sato-san, I assume you're wondering about what I'm wearing, aren't you? This is known as a shihakusho. And it is the standard uniform worn by all Shinigami. As she'd suspected, Sato didn't react to her revelation. He'd obviously put two and two together at Urahara's words. Orihime, on the other hand, gasped. That means... You're Dash. Yes, I am a Shinigami. This is why I asked if you could see me. Unless you had spiritual powers or were just a soul, you shouldn't have been able to see me. So you're not alive? Sato asked. Well, Shinigami were once alive. I lived and died over 100 years ago. Oh. Orihime covered her mouth in shock. I'm so sorry. Rukia had to smile at the innocence of the comment. It's fine, really. I love my time in the afterlife. Wait, but, if we aren't supposed to be able to see you, then why can everyone in school see you? Ah, that's because we use a jigai, an artificial body that we can enter to interact normally with living beings. Wait, hang on. Orihime started looking around. Where's Kurosaki-kun? Rukia had already expected them to notice Ichigo's absence sooner or later. But she still didn't know how to answer them. He's, indisposed right now. Actually, Urahara suddenly interjected. We've come to the main crux of why I've called you two here. Now, all this is definitely a lot to take in, and I'm sure you two definitely have more questions to ask, and they'll be answered in due time. However, there's something else you two must learn about. Rukia frowned at Urahara, her suspicions growing over what he meant exactly. He's not doing what I think he's going to do, is he? She thought. This is not some run-of-the-mill hollow. It's way too dangerous for either of them. Urahara continued, not knowing, or not bothering, about Rukia's chain of thought. As you both might have figured out by now, yes, Ichigo-san is also a Shinigami. You also might have picked up on the fact that Shinigami don't stay in the living world for prolonged periods of time, yet both your classmates have been in your class for almost a year. Both Orihime and Sato nodded. The reason for that is that they have both been exiled from Soul Society after being framed for a crime they were actually victims of, a crime punishable by execution. Orihime covered her mouth in shock. That's horrible. Well, actually, it was just Ichigo-san. Rukia-san couldn't bear to leave him, so she tagged along for the ride, but that makes her a fugitive too. He grinned at her, but Rukia's expression didn't change. Urahara-san, surely you're not going to dash. To cut a long story short, Urahara continued. During the Hollow invasion, Ichigo-san was arrested, captured, and taken back to Soul Society. Rukia-san is going to return to Soul Society to rescue him, and I would like to ask you two to join her. Chapter 50, Preparations. 1 week later. Soul Society. Ichigo was bored. But really, there was no surprise there. After all, there was only so much one could do in a spacious cell that was empty, save for a futon tucked away in one corner and the hard chair he was currently seated on. He'd already counted the number of bars on his cell, 40, determined how many guards were on rotation for guarding his cell, 12, and measured the dimensions of his cell, 8 by 6 meters. Alternatively, he could eavesdrop on the conversations of the guards that were currently standing guard outside his cell. Given that he was being held in the 6th Division's detention cell, he still recognized a couple of the Shinigami guards. The rest were relatively new, having been posted to the division after he'd left it. While the more senior guards had been eager to speak to him, even they didn't dare disobey a direct order from Byakuya, forbidding them from interacting him. But they were still standing close enough for him to pick up on their conversations. And considering that no one had been by after his farce of a trial last week, he supposed the rest of the division, and the rest of the Seriidii, had been barred from visiting him as well. After all, he knew how fast the rumor mill in the Godii 13 could spin. It still annoyed him every time he thought about the trial he'd received. It wasn't even a trial to begin with, it was more of a competition between the Central 46 officials to see who could speak the loudest. By the time the trial ended, his ears were ringing. He hadn't even been able to get many words in edgewise. As expected, he'd been summarily sentenced to death for hollow experimentation and for possessing hollow powers. Sick of them shouting over him, Ichigo hadn't bothered trying to defend himself with the fact that he had his hollow under control. He doubted the Central 46 officials would have listened anyway. At least he hadn't been executed on the spot. That would have completely derailed any plans for his escape. Instead, he was to be executed by the Sokayaku in a month's time, or 20 days from the present. It was done, apparently, to ensure that whatever hollow powers he had could not possess him. Ever since then, he'd been imprisoned in the 6th Division detention block, although he was scheduled to be moved to the Senzakyu a week before his execution. Naturally, Ichigo didn't plan on going anywhere near Sokayaku Hill. He had every confidence Rukia would have busted him out long before that. He didn't want to think of the possibilities of her failing. He stared at the Ryatsu-blocking cuffs that had been placed on his wrists, and idly tugged at them lightly. As a third seat, and subsequently lieutenant of the 6th Division, he'd had to use this on the occasional detainee. As the name suggested, it blocked the Ryatsu of its wearer, preventing them from using their powers to escape. But he'd quickly discovered that the cuffs had a limit. While it blocked him from accessing a huge portion of his powers, he was still able to release a weak, Hado No. 1, Sai, with enough force to make someone stagger. Perhaps the cuffs hadn't been designed to hold a captain-level Shinigami. It definitely wasn't enough to help him escape, but it could prove useful in future. His thoughts shifted to Rukia. Even before they became a couple, they'd rarely been apart for extended PRDS of time. The last had been during his initial hollow suppression training, and in admittedly less dire circumstances. In all honesty, he'd been doubting the sanity of his hastily constructed plan of having Rukia bust him out. While he knew what she was capable of, he couldn't be certain of how it measured up against the other Taicho, who were certainly her biggest obstacle. But given the situation, he'd been hard-pressed to come up with a better one in the time they had. Still, it wasn't like he had a choice in that matter now. So all he could do now was to put his faith in Rukia and watch for an opportunity. Just then, he heard the main doors open. He stayed put with his back against the cell entrance, but he nearly turned round when he heard a familiar voice curtly addressing the guards, "Wait outside. I want to speak to the prisoner alone." "Hi, Abarai Fukutechu." As the guards exited the room, the cell fell into silence. Ichigo could just picture Renji standing by the bars, watching him with his arms folded and a hostile scowl on his face. After a minute of tense silence, Renji still hadn't spoken a word, so Ichigo decided to break the deadlock. "Judging by the fact that you've been standing there without speaking, I suppose you're not here to bust me out." "What for?" "It'll only just speed up the inevitable when they catch you and kill you," Renji replied icily. "Then why not do so? After all, it sounds like something you'd want to happen." When Renji didn't reply, Ichigo turned round to look at his former friend. True to form, he was standing right outside the cell in the exact same pose Ichigo imagined him to be in. However, the hostility apparent on his face was tinged with a hint of sadness and hurt. While the past few days had been largely spent in boredom, Ichigo had had time to ponder about recent events. And to be honest, he was confused over Renji's behavior. He, Rukia, and Renji had been inseparable as they did their best to survive in Inuzuri. With only each other to depend on, it formed a close bond between them that appeared unbreakable. But when they'd become Shinigami, Renji had slowly but surely drifted away from them. Sure, they'd been in different divisions, and he had preferred to spend time with Rukia, but that didn't explain the look of anger on Renji's face back in the living world. It was a look that bordered on hatred. He'd felt at the moment they crossed swords, Renji had attacked with the intent to kill. And he didn't know what caused it. "You think I'm guilty, don't you?" Ichigo asked bluntly, taking a stab in the dark. While he didn't believe that his former friend could think that little of him, there really weren't any other possible explanations. Renji's expression lost its anger for the briefest of moments. "It doesn't matter what I think." "I think it does, actually," Ichigo responded simply. "You were prepared to kill me back in the living world. And just now, you considered helping me escape, just so I could get myself caught and killed earlier. What the hell? You actually believed what I said?" Renji brushed it off with an irritated wave of his hand. "It was just a joke." "Can't believe you can't take jokes now." Ichigo turned round fully to face Renji. In case you've forgotten, USCK at lying, he retorted loudly, already growing tired of Renji's behavior. Renji snorted. Like hell you would know. Not really sure what to make of it, Ichigo disregarded it. Even if you didn't really mean it, you've obviously entertained that thought at some point. The question is, why? And no matter how I try, I can't think of a possible explanation other than the fact that you think I'm guilty of hollow experimentation. Renji looked at him square in the eye, and Ichigo caught a hint of an unidentifiable expression before it returned to one of anger. Then apparently you weren't thinking hard enough. He closed his eyes, biting back the urge to walk up to Renji and smack his head against the bars. It seemed like his former friend didn't think him guilty, but it didn't look like he was going to get the real reason out of him either. What happened, Renji? He asked, forcing himself to remain calm. He frowned. What are you talking about? The three of us, Rukia, you, and I, we used to be inseparable. We survived through Inuzuri, we made the best of what we had, depending on one another to eke out way through the afterlife. We journeyed to Siriidii to become Shinigami after losing our friends to hollows, stood side by side against numerous hollows, and nearly got killed doing so. And even when we had to separate, we vowed to remain friends, and while it was never convenient, we still found time to hang out. So what changed, Renji? What happened during these past few years to result in you wanting me dead? Renji opened his mouth to answer, but snapped it shut. Clearly, this wasn't how he expected the conversation to turn out. Eventually, without saying a word, Renji turned round and stalked out of the cell block. Ichigo stared after Renji's retreating form, before leaning back against his chair. He closed his eyes, not bothering to look up at the sounds of the guards returning to their posts. He found himself breathing quite heavily, and forced himself to cool down. No doubt his agitation was caused by his confrontation with Renji. He'd nearly lost his cool over Renji's attitude, but thankfully, he'd been able to restrain himself. Attacking a vice-captain wasn't going to help him one bit. It might have provided some satisfaction, but the trouble wasn't worth it. At least he'd eliminated one possible reason for Renji's actions. Unfortunately, that brought him no closer to the actual answer. In fact, it only raised more questions, of which he currently had no means of finding out. With nothing else to do, he resumed his wait. 1 week later. Good morning, nephew. Thwack, ack. Quitted you, old man. Scuffling sounds continued echoing out from the second floor of the Kurosaki household, a stark contrast to the peace and normalcy that could be found on the first floor. Good morning, Rukia-ne. Yuzu said cheerfully as Rukia entered the kitchen. The younger twin was in the midst of preparing breakfast. She was ladling miso soup into 5 bowls for the entire family. Rukia returned the greeting, placing her school bag at the table before immediately heading to help, as she had been doing for quite some time. She didn't know how to cook, but she could at least assist in minor areas. Just then, there was a particularly loud thump, followed by a victorious cry from the Kurosaki patriarch. 12th in a row. You're losing your touch, my dear nephew. The immediate silence that followed was approaching deafening. Hey Rukia-ne, Yuzu suddenly asked. Is Ichi-ni sick? Not that I know of. Why? Oh. He's never lost against Ota-san before, and now he has lost so many times in a row. If he's really sick, perhaps I should ask Ota-san to hold back on the attacks. Just then, Isshin bounded down the stairs, greeting the two of them in his usual rambunctious way. He was followed by Karen, whose face only contained a touch of annoyance at the daily morning noise. Immediately, Yuzu rounded on her father about the possibility of Ichi-ni being sick, and how he should perhaps not attack him till he recovered. Isshin waved it off, insisting that it would help Ichigo get well by keeping his senses sharp. Karen offered no opinion at all. Inwardly, Rukia had to marvel at how they were discussing attacking someone in the same casual tone people use to discuss the weather. But most importantly, she was relieved that they'd chalked down Ichigo's dip in physical prowess as an illness. By the time Ichigo appeared downstairs, Yuzu had haggled the number of attacks down to 3 times a week, although Isshin reserved the right to choose which day. Catching the tail end of the bargaining, Ichigo sent Rukia a quick pleading look. It was a look extremely unbecoming of him, but knowing that that wasn't Ichigo, she settled for shooting him a warning look and shaking her head slightly, making him sigh softly. Taking pity on him, Rukia quickly polished off her breakfast and left with Ichigo, waiting only long enough for Yuzu to pack his food and remind Rukia to make sure he ate it. It was good for his health after all. "How are you holding up?" Rukia asked once they were out of earshot. It was like a dam had burst. Ichigo immediately launched into a tirade about crazy old doctors and child abuse. "This wasn't what I signed up for when I agreed to double up in Ichigo's body," he half-whined. Rukia resisted the urge to roll her eyes, wondering what Ichigo would do if he ever heard himself speak in that whiny tone. "It's only for a few more days until I leave for Soul Society, Kon. You can endure it." Kon brightened up slightly upon hearing that there was a possible end to the torture. But he still continued to mutter under his breath, thinking up stupid, but admittedly creative ways he could get back at Isshin. Rukia hadn't remained idle these past 2 weeks. After reluctantly agreeing to let Sato and Orihime join the rescue team, she, Urahara, and Yoruchi had started planning for the mission while her 2 classmates focused on intensive training. One of the first and foremost problems was transporting Sato and Orihime to Soul Society. Since they were both still alive, they couldn't simply just up and waltz into Soul Society as they were. Separating their souls from their bodies was out of the question too. Furthermore, they had a time limit looming over their heads. By sneaking into Soul Society, Yoruchi was able to determine that Ichigo, after a speedy trial, had been sentenced to death for illegally acquiring hollow powers. It was scheduled to be held a month from the sentence, 2 weeks away from the present day. Upon hearing this, part of Rukia was curious about how her sensei managed to avoid detection, but thoughts of Ichigo's impending execution was enough to stem her curiosity. Even before this information, Urahara had already started working on a way to send living humans to Soul Society. But upon learning about this time limit, he immediately upped his efforts. "I should be done with 2 weeks still left on the clock," Urahara had declared. "You guys can head out when I'm done." He didn't address the elephant in the room, and neither did Rukia want him to. Aside from her regular trips to gather information, Yoruchi began training the 2 students extensively, both in the use of their powers and how to fight. Rukia was surprised to hear that Orihime actually held a black belt in karate. Nevertheless, having fighting skills sped up training by a considerable amount. Both Sato and Orihime were able to start harnessing their powers within a day, and immediately began training with them. The next issue was handling Ichigo's disappearance. It was decided that the 3 of them would return to school as per normal, since they couldn't enter Soul Society yet anyway. However, how were they going to explain Ichigo's disappearance? Possible explanations they coughed up were flimsy at best, so they eventually decided that the best option was to use a mod soul to double up as Ichigo, since Urahara still had his Jigai. However, most regular mod souls were only engineered to inhabit a body temporarily. They were mass-manufactured to have a distinct personality, one that was usually considered unusual to most. Also, they lacked the ability to modify their personalities to suit different circumstances. Enter Kon. Kon was what Urahara called an enhanced mod soul. They were named as such as they had been created a few decades ago as a means to aid in combating hollows. As such, they were different from a normal mod soul, and had combat capabilities slightly below that of an average unranked Shinigami. But more importantly, even though they came with their own wacky personality, they possessed a limited ability to learn and adapt, something that was deemed useful in helping them fight hollows. A few hundred of them had been created as a trial run. However, when many of them fell to hollows, some in quite gruesome manners, the project was eventually deemed as too inhumane and was shut down. While most of the enhanced souls had been destroyed, Kon was one of the few that still remained. Urahara explained that with its limited ability to learn, it could learn enough about Ichigo's mannerisms and behaviors to pass off as the real deal. Of course, it wasn't going to pass muster around people like the Kurosaki household. Being in regular contact with Ichigo, they would surely be able to notice any behavioral changes. But that was where Rukia came in. Being his partner, she could instruct the enhanced mod better about Ichigo's routine in the Kurosaki household. The first thing she did was give it the name Kon, as calling him Ichigo was too strange for her, unless it was in a public setting and unavoidable. Then, she gave him a crash course in some of Ichigo's behaviors and preferences. It wasn't perfect, but she could perhaps chalk any oddities down to an illness. For his part, Kon performed fairly admirably, and was able to pull off a passable impression of Ichigo. Rukia was only required to step in occasionally to correct his behavior. However, she had her hands full when it came to reining in Kon's own quirky personality, which could unfortunately be aptly described as perverted young man. And there wasn't a worse place to drop such a personality than a school full of teenage girls with developed bodies. She had to constantly stop Kon from openly ogling at their female classmates' chests and attempting to look up their skirts. Not surprisingly, his main target was Orihime. At least she was privy to the fact that that wasn't Ichigo, so she would wave it off every time, albeit with a huge blush on her face. Sure, she could easily explain it away as hormones, but they were supposed to be a couple, and such behavior was distinctively un-Ichigo-ish. Rukia had also warned Kon about Kurosaki Ishin's daily morning ritual of attacking Ichigo. The mod's soul had appeared concerned at first, but had eventually waved it off with the famous last words, "It can't be that bad." It only took him a day to eat his words. Lacking the speed and agility of the real Ichigo, Kon stood no chance against the crazed doctor, and woke up daily in a battered state. But with Yuzu's intervention today, at least he wouldn't have to suffer as much. That was fine, despite all the trouble he'd caused her, she still would have stepped in herself. Eventually. While waiting for classes to begin, Rukia couldn't help but let her mind wander again. Her honed sense of hearing picked up on the conversations around her, most of them excitedly discussing the plans they'd arranged, plans they couldn't wait to get started on once the final bell rang at the end of today, signaling the beginning of summer vacation. She marveled at how focused they were on their upcoming vacations, completely unaware that 3 of their fellow classmates were making preparations to embark on a life or death, or a death or permanent death, journey to rescue another of their classmates. Said classmate's body was still present, but it was inhabited by a substitute soul. Even that sounded weird when phrased that way. Speaking of which, she wondered how Ichigo was. Even after 2 weeks, it still felt weird to see Kon inhabiting Ichigo's jigai. She would often turn to him, and for a split second forget that it wasn't Ichigo she was speaking to. Though she wasn't going to admit it, it felt strange without Ichigo around. Even before they became a couple, they'd spent most of their time together, be it for training or just being alone together, until it felt just like second nature. Starting a relationship together didn't change that routine much, they simply added on the perks of being a couple. But without him around, she still wasn't used to the sudden change in behavior, it always felt like something was missing. And that made her even more determined to rescue him. Still, she wasn't going to lie to herself, the chances of rescuing Ichigo were slim. But she'd made a promise. One she fully intended to keep. Plus, she didn't want to think of the consequences if she failed. Her gaze fell on Yuryu. While she understood his reasons, he was still the indirect cause of Ichigo now facing certain death in 2 weeks' time. And although he'd admittedly tried to intervene when Ichigo was being taken away, he'd yet to make any effort to approach her, let alone speak to her or offer any form of apology. She would often catch him looking at her with a conflicted expression, as though fighting the urge to speak to her. And each time, he would always end up looking away instead. She noted with grim satisfaction that both hands and forearms of his were still heavily bandaged, although his right was no longer tinged red with blood that had seeped through. He moved slightly, and a gleam of light reflected off something on his left wrist, catching her eye. 2 thin identical rod-like things were protruding out on opposite sides of his bandaged wrist, as though he had driven a long thin spike through his wrist. When had that been there, she wondered. Just then, Oki-sensei entered the classroom, which was the signal for everyone to halt their conversations. But given that it was the last day of school, a moderate buzz still remained. "Alright, settle down everyone." Oki-sensei rapped her wrist loudly on the form book. "Now, I know today is the last day of school, and I would gladly love to just let you all do whatever you want. But I have to pretend to be having a serious dash." That was the furthest she got, as the side window suddenly exploded inward with a loud crash, and a large ball came speeding in towards the front of the classroom. Screams rang out as everyone ducked for cover, including Oki-sensei. Her senses on immediate high alert, Rukia recovered instantly. Her eyes quickly locked onto the projectile, which was barreling straight towards the center of the chalkboard. She had just enough time to register the image on the ball, a picture of Urahara's face next to a hand making a V sign, before it collided with the chalkboard and exploded with a burst of red paint. It splattered out in all directions, covering the entire chalkboard with thick, red paint. There was silence as everyone stared at the viscous mess in shock. "All right, who did this?" Oki-sensei shrieked upon finding her voice. Who in the world thought it'd be a good idea to vandalize my chalkboard? And on the last day of school? While she wasn't responsible, she most definitely knew who was, so Rukia kept a shocked look on her face, imitating her classmates and looking around the classroom. She wondered if Sato and Orihime saw the picture of Urahara on the ball. If they did, she hoped they wouldn't give anything away. "Well?" Oki-sensei prompted. "Asano?" All heads immediately swiveled to Kigo. "I didn't do it, sensei." Kigo denied vehemently. Oki-sensei's eyes narrowed in suspicion, but before she could challenge the lanky teen, Michiru suddenly exclaimed, "Sensei, look. There are words on the board." Their teacher turned round, and the class fell silent again. The red paint was slowly flowing down the board, revealing words written in red paint. "The preparations are complete," Oki-sensei read out as the words were slowly revealed. "Gather at the usual location. You may depart tonight." "What the heck is this?" she exclaimed yet again. "It looks like it's written in blood. For the dead." She turned her glare back to her students, obviously attempting to discern the culprit from their looks. "Sensei, there are more words at the bottom." And sure enough, most of the paint had flowed off the chalkboard. And right at the bottom corner was another message in a smaller font, "And if you think this is a message for the dead and written in blood, then you have no sense of humor." Needless to say, Oki-sensei wasn't impressed. 9 hours, 3 teachers, 2 bag and locker inspections, 1 DSPLN master, 1 principal, copious amounts of paint thinner, and lots of cleaning equipment later, the paint was finally cleared off. During that time, Rukia was able to confirm with Sato and Orihime that they both knew whom the message was from, and who it was meant for. Aside from that, all they had to do was not raise the suspicions of the school staff. After all, while they weren't responsible, they certainly knew who was. Thankfully, they were able to avoid suspicion, and once they were finally released 2 hours after everyone else, the 3 of them, plus Khan, were the first ones out the door. After a quick agreement to meet outside Urahara's shop at 7:30, Rukia left with Khan in the opposite direction from Sato and Orihime. As they headed back, there was a definite spring in Khan's steps. Rukia had also informed him that they were headed to Soul Society tonight. While that didn't matter much to him, it also spelt an end to the assaults inflicted on him by a certain Kurosaki Ishin, and that was good news as far as he was concerned. Unfortunately, in his glee, he promptly forgot they still had to return to the Kurosaki household for a while. And that placed him within reach of the Kurosaki doctor. "We're back," Rukia announced as she opened the front door. The soft sounds of people speaking was drifting over from the television. Yuzu's head poked out from behind the couch. "Oh. Hello Rukia-ne, Ichi and I. Karen's still at Dash. Welcome back nephew." Afk. Rukia whipped round just in time to see Ishin crash land onto Ichigo from above. She couldn't help but winced as they fell to the ground in a tangled heap. What the hell? What's your problem, you crazy old man? Isshin was the first to untangle himself, and he bounced right back up, completely unfazed despite having jumped from the second floor. Aerial attacks, my dear boy. You forgot about them. Oto-san. Yuzu chastised. I thought you said you were only going to attack Ichigo 3 times a week. I did. Isshin grinned. And that wasn't an attack. I just happened to gain the sudden urge to jump from my nephew's bedroom window on the second floor. Such a pity that said nephew just happened to be directly below it when I jumped. Yuzu pouted. That still counts. No, it doesn't. You called it an attack yourself. As Yuzu continued to argue with her father over what constituted an attack, Rukia shook her head in exasperation before helping Kon up. I really can't wait to be shot of this madhouse, he grumbled under his breath. 2 hours later. Welcome back everyone. Urahara announced as Rukia, already out of her jigai, Kon, Sato, and Orihime approached the entrance to his shop. I take it you all got my message. Right in front of so many others. And in paint that looks like blood. Really? Rukia narrowed her eyes at the shopkeeper. Urahara merely brushed it off with a wave of his fan. Why not? Just trying to lighten up the mood a little. It's the start of summer vacation. No need to be so stiff. Rukia sighed, but dropped the issue. She had long gotten used to Urahara's antics, so in hindsight, she should have expected him to pull some ridiculous stunt for something as simple as passing a message. Never mind. May we enter? Immediately, Urahara became more solemn. As you wish. But first, Kon. Hearing his name, Kon stepped forward. Tessai, who had been standing silently next to Urahara, came up to him. He donned a familiar red and blue glove with a flaming skull pattern on his hand. Then, he placed the gloved hand on the back of Kon's head and gave a push. Out popped the Jikongan that housed Kon's soul, straight into Urahara's outstretched hand. The jigai flopped lifelessly to the ground, but Tessai caught it in his hands. Deftly, he flipped the jigai over his shoulder before disappearing back into the shop. Urahara chuckled at the fascinated looks on the 2 teenagers. You get used to it after a while. Now, before we proceed, there's still someone we're missing. At this, Rukia became confused. We are. Who? That would be me, a voice suddenly spoke up from behind them. Not immediately recognizing the voice, Rukia turned round. A feeling of surprise and anger descended as she saw Ishida Yuryu walking towards them. Once again, Yuryu was dressed in the traditional all-white quincy garment, looking pretty much the same as when he'd approached her in Ichigo. 2 weeks back. He was walking with his hands behind his back, but as he reached up to adjust his glasses, Rukia saw that his gloved hand wasn't swathed with bandages and appeared just fine. Ishida-kun? Orihime asked. What are you doing here? Having never heard or seen Yuryu in action, both she and Sato looked understandably confused. Rukia, on the other hand, wasn't. Yes, what are you doing here? She asked him coldly as he reached them. No particular reason, he replied in the same irritatingly aloof manner. I just happened to be in the area and decided to see what all the fuss was about. Rukia sighed in frustration, resisting the urge to smack him. Ishida, enough with that mysterious bullshit, especially after you've avoided saying a single word to me these past 2 weeks. Now, let me ask again, what are you doing here? She asked, even though she suspected she already knew the answer. Yuryu turned to stare at her, but she didn't avert her glare. Eventually, he answered, I heard that you 3 were going to rescue Kurosaki. I've come to offer my aid. It was just as she suspected, but Rukia wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. She raised an eyebrow. Really? I thought you hated Shinigami. I've come to recognize the wisdom of Kurosaki's words. As a matter of fact, Urahara interjected, Ishida-san approached me 2 days after Kurosaki-san was taken away. He heard about your plan to rescue Kurosaki-san and requested to join in the rescue effort, on the condition that I did not tell you about his involvement. Well, that was certainly news to Rukia. Oh. She looked back at Yuryu, whose face was now sporting a slight red tinge. The Quincy adjusted his glasses again. It's the least I could do, I guess, he eventually relented. Rukia regarded him for a moment, but his expression didn't change. Well, I suppose another pair of hands wouldn't hurt. Excellent. Urahara clapped his hands together. Now, if you would all please follow me, we shall begin the final preparations. And without another word, he turned and headed back into his shop, and the 4 of them followed after him. The first thing Rukia saw when she descended into the vast, empty training grounds was the huge square stone arch sitting right in the middle. In front of it stood Yoruchi, and to her surprise, Hirako Shinji. Yo! Yoruchi waved to them as they approached. How's it going? You guys ready yet? Rukia bowed to her sensei. As ready as we can be, Yoruchi-sensei. Thank you for coming along to aid us. Nonsense, there's no need to thank me, she waved her off. There's nothing wrong with me wanting to help my student rescue her beau, she grinned at Rukia. Now remember, when you get Ichigo out, be sure to give him the most RSNG kiss you've ever given him, preferably in front of dear Bayabo. Right, Rukia intoned, not knowing how to respond. Wanting to avoid further embarrassment, she turned to Hirako. Are you coming along as well, Hirako-san? Hirako shrugged before grinning. As one of us, we have a vested interest in Ichigo as well. Can't go leave him hanging without being part of it, eh? But don't you two have a bounty on your head? They'll capture or even kill you. I'll just have to avoid losing then. Relax. He added upon seeing her unconvinced look. I was a Taicho too, remember? I be fine. While far from convinced, she relented and turned to Urahara. So is this it? Indeed it is, the shopkeeper replied. Now as you all know, soul society exists as a spiritual realm, and only souls or spiritual beings can enter there. While Kuchiki-san, Hirako-san and Yoruchi can enter it just fine, the same can't be said for the 3 of you, he said, looking at Sato, Orihime, and Yuryu. While the 3 of you have spiritual powers, your souls have not been separated from your living bodies yet. Therefore, you would normally not be able to enter, not even Ishida-san, despite having a much better control over his spiritual powers. Excuse me, Urahara-san, Orihime cut in apologetically. But I'm just curious. What kind of powers do Hirako-san and Ishida-kun have? Oh yes, you haven't heard about the both of them yet. Hirako Shinji is, or was, a Shinigami as well. At this, Hirako gave Orihime a wide smile, only for Yoruchi to prod him hard in the back. As to why he's here, let's just say that he's in the same position as me, Yoruchi, and Kuchiki-san. On the other hand, Ishida-san is. Would you mind if I? It's fine, Yuryu replied. Very well. In short, Ishida belongs to a group of people called the Quincy, who are born with great spiritual power, and have been trained since young to harness this power. What this power manifests as, I'll leave it to Ishida-san to reveal it to you, as and when he wishes to do so. Oh, you mean there are more of people like you? Orihime asked. Well. As far as I know, I'm the only remaining one. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Now, as I was saying, Urahara continued. Originally, the only way you can enter soul society was for you to sever the connection between your soul and your living body. Unfortunately, such a process is irreversible, and there is no way to reattach your soul to your living body once the chain is severed. In other words, such an act would essentially kill you, and I trust none of you want that. Indeed, all 3 of them looked a little green upon hearing that. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is where this lovely masterpiece comes into play. Urahara directed their attentions to the stone arch with a flourish of his hand. Beside him, Yoruchi snorted, but he happily soldiered on. This archway is called the Reisher Henkin-ki, and what it does is simple. It temporarily fuses your living body with your soul into one entity. As a result, your body essentially becomes like any other soul, and will be made of spiritual particles, allowing you to move about freely within the spiritual realm. When you return back to the living world, all you need to return back to normal is pass through this arch again. Any questions so far? All three shook their heads. To start the process, simply pass through the arch. I will open up a portal to the spiritual realm just behind this arch, so just pass through it before you enter and you'll be good to go. The effect is instantaneous, so don't worry about any delays. Kuchiki-san, since you don't have a living body, passing through the arch would have no effect on you. Is it safe? Orihime asked uncertainly. Oh yes. Perfectly safe. I wasn't the research head of Soul Society for nothing. Alright, are there any more questions? Rukia asked the others. The three Karakura High students shook their heads. In that case, is everyone ready to set off? Yoruchi, Hirako, and Yuryu immediately answered. Sato and Orihime both looked a little pale, but nodded their confirmations. Excellent. Now, there's one more thing to take note of. When you enter the portal, you'll find yourself in a tunnel. This tunnel is a passageway into Soul Society and exists as a separate realm. Unfortunately, I can only keep it open for a maximum of 5 minutes, so the moment you enter, you'll have to run as fast as you can towards the exit. If the tunnel closes before you make it out, you'll be trapped within that dimension forever, with no way to escape. Still, no pressure. I'm confident that you all are fast enough to make it through. From what I've learned about Shinigami, Yuryu interjected. They don't travel through such dangerous means. And you would be correct, Ishida-san. Shinigami traverse between realms using the Senkamen, a gate that can be opened by any Shinigami, even Kuchiki-san over here. However, to use it safely, one needs a special creature called the Jigakucho, which, as the name suggests, takes the form of a butterfly. Without it, one would be forced to travel through this tunnel I mentioned before. You can't give us one? Sato asked. Unfortunately not. Official Shinigami require authorization to utilize the Jigakucho. As an exile from Soul Society, I cannot provide the required authorization. Given time, I could perhaps create something that mimics its effects, but I'm sure you'll agree that time is something we do not have much of. Besides, every person who passes through the Senkamen needs one Jigakucho each, so even if I could summon one now, it wouldn't be enough. But really, there's no need to worry. I'm sure you all will be able to make it through without issue. Just run forward once you enter and don't hesitate. Alright everyone. Yoruchi suddenly barked out. If there are no further questions, we shall begin shortly. Everyone please stand in a line facing the arch. Everyone did as they were told. Now, before Kisuke opens the portal, there is one more thing he has forgotten to mention. While this device allows you to enter Soul Society, its biggest drawback to this is that since your body and soul essentially become one, if you get killed in Soul Society, both will cease to exist. At this, the three living humans paled and stared at her with varying degrees of shock. Clearly, none of them had given much thought on the possibility of them dying. And while I thank you all for joining in this dangerous mission, I must stress again that there isn't any obligation on your part to stay, and there can be no turning back once you step through the gate and into the portal. So I'd like to ask this one question one last time: do you wish to continue, knowing that failure could very well mean a permanent death? She looked at all three of them pointedly. The three of them looked back at her. Orihime looked slightly uncertain for a moment, but she steeled herself and nodded resolutely. Sato remained silent, but no one could mistake the hardened determination in his eyes. But it was Ishida that spoke up first. It's like how Hirako-san put it. If there's no turning back, then we just continue moving forward. And if failure means death, then we will just have to keep winning. At his words, Yoruchi looked at him for a few seconds before breaking into a smile. Nicely put. Alright, everyone get ready. Urahara took over. The countdown will begin the moment I activate the portal, so the moment I say go, run through the portal. Remember, once you step into the dangai, just keep running forward. Don't stop, and don't hesitate. That 1 second might just be the difference between escaping and getting trapped. Yoruchi will bring up the rear of the group, and since she naturally has no intentions of getting stuck inside forever, do not fall behind, or she'll be forced to drag you out with her. And trust me, if that happens, you'll probably wish you were trapped for all eternity instead, he ended with a grin. Yoruchi rolled her eyes but didn't comment, merely moving to stand behind the group. Kisuke, activate the portal. Nodding, Urahara walked up to the portal. He tapped the side of the Reisher Henkin key with his cane, and almost immediately, 4 bolts of purple energy shot out from the corners. They coalesced into a ball at the center of the portal before expanding outwards to fill the entire arch. Okay. Urahara called out over the thrum of the bright purple energy. The Reisher Henkin key has been activated. Next, I'm going to activate the portal that will lead directly to the dangai. It's directly behind the converter so you wouldn't see it. But the moment I say go, just run through the archway and head for the light. Ready? And... Raising his cane once again, he rapped the side of the portal once more. Go. Upon Urahara's command, Rukia kicked off towards the portal. On either sides of her, the others surged forward as well, but her gaze was firmly fixed forward, or more specifically, what lay beyond the veil. If she was being honest with herself, Rukia was doubtful of her chances. Their group of 6 had to wade through thousands of Shinigami to reach their goal. While these Shinigami posed little threat even in numbers, there were still the 13 captains to deal with, not to mention the vice-captains. But she viciously quashed these doubts. She couldn't afford to even hesitate a second, Ichigo's life depended on it. So as they rapidly closed in on the portal, Rukia focused on one thought only. We're coming for you, Ichigo. Soul Society. Ichigo's eyes flew open as the keening wail of a klaxon blared throughout the Siriidii, filtering in through his prison cell window. It wasn't the sound that intrigued him though, there was always something going on in the Siriidii. Rather, it was the fact that it was an alarm he had never heard before. Perhaps it was some newly implemented system, but a quick glance at the current guards on duty suggested that they too didn't know what was going on. Unusual readings. Sections 3-2. Shift 2. High. Drill. Ichigo sat up more attentively on his futon as the garbled words reached him. Being isolated from the outside, if it was information worth gleaning. It took at least a minute, but he was eventually able to make out the announcement in its entirety. Attention. Attention. Unusual readings have been detected in the western sector. Patrols in sections 3-8 are to shift to high alert while awaiting further instructions. This is not a drill. Attention. Attention. Unusual readings. While he had no means to be certain, his instincts pointed to only one possible reason. Rukia, he smiled. It's about time.